Goku, soy Goku. Hola, soy Goku. Hola, soy Goku. Tu pendejo. ¿Qué pasa, chavales? ¿Cómo estáis? Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio de FORZA Horizonte 5. El día de hoy vamos a continuar con esta nueva semana de Forcita, segunda semana del año lunar. ¿Qué dices, Mazatlán? Pero tengo 8 canales que hacer para mañana. Hijo de su puta madre, 8, güey. Pásame, te ayudo con 2, güey. ¿De qué son? Ahorita los hago, güey, en chinga. No es cierto, pendejo. Cámara, te veas huevos. Huevos.
First. Yeah, so I think that we have a huge country full of a lot of people, a lot of individual talents, capabilities. And I think that the goal of government, broadly speaking, should be to try to ensure that everybody's able to achieve as much as possible. So on a liberal level, that usually means some people might need a little bit of a boost when it comes to things like education. They might need a little bit of a boost when it comes to providing certain necessities like housing or food or clothing. But broadly speaking, I mean, I'm still a liberal, I'm not a communist or a socialist. I don't believe in the total command economy, total communist takeover of all of the economy. But I think that broadly speaking, the government should help.
And that government
Tengo que regular el volumen.
Not necessarily. I noticed that when liberals talk about government, or especially taxes, it seems like they talk about it for taxes' sake, or they
Vamos a jugar la temporada mientras de fondo voy a escuchar. Cámara, más nos vemos después. Gracias, por cierto. Gracias, tío. Ese podcast que es un debate entre Ben Shapiro y Destiny. Está bueno, es buen debate. Lo parte está el Lex Friedman. Así que vamos a escuchar, vamos a ver qué dicen mientras jugamos esta temporada. Ya tú sabes cómo da.
So people talk about taxes sometimes as like a punishment. Tax the rich. I think taxing the rich is fine insofar as it funds the programs that we want to fund. But Democrats have a really big problem demonizing success or wealth, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to be wealthy, to be a billionaire or whatever, as long as we're funding what we need.
Por cierto, yo tengo el Ioniq 6 de Hyundai, se los voy a mostrar antes de nada, para que lo vean. Últimamente tengo este objetivo pendejo, la verdad, que es de ponerle body kit a todos los autos a los que se puede meter body kit, porque me gusta el body kit. Y le he metido body kit a un chingo de coches. Un día voy a hacer un especial de todos mis autos con body kit, porque me maman. Chequen, aquí está el Ioniq 6. Es el auto del mes, el primer auto del mes. Son 2 autos mensuales, digamos, que dan, especiales. Y luego están 2 autos semanales. Este es el primer del mes. ¿Okay? Es uno de los 2 mensual. Es el Ioniq 6, es un auto eléctrico de Hyundai. Está interesante. La verdad es que en color negro no me gusta tanto cómo se ve el auto, fíjate. Lo pinté hace un momento de color rojo, creo que se ve un poquillo mejor. En general, pues es un auto eléctrico, es un sedán eléctrico de Hyundai, no esperas mucho, pero no está mal, buen auto. Creo que unas modificaciones y queda un buen auto clase A, clase S1, sin problemas. Y pues la forma está chistosa, es como un frijol, ¿sabes? Tiene una forma como de bean. Así que nada, ahí está el Ioniq 6 de Hyundai. Interesante. El interior pues muy autoeléctrico, pero normal Hyundai, tranquilo. Pues no está mal. Ok, eso para que quede aquí, que aquí está. A ver, vamos con la CISO.
So first of all, I'm glad that
De una vez vamos
Destiny
con
already
una
coming out as
LTA.
Republican. That's exciting. I mean, we hold a lot in common in terms of the basic idea that
2 minutos, changos.
people ought to have as much opportunity opportunity as possible, and also insofar as the government should do.
El frente de este coche no sé por qué me recuerda como a un... Algo tiene, me recuerda a un Honda, a un Toyota, el frente del auto. Me recuerda a un Toyota, no sé por qué. De atrás me parece un Porsche viejo. Está raro. Está raro. No feo, solo raro.
The minimum amount necessary to interfere in people's lives in order to pursue certain functions, particularly at the local level. So a lot of governmental discussion on the pragmatic level end up being discussions about where government ought to be involved, but also at what level government ought to be involved. And I have an incredibly linear view of government. I think that local governments, because you have higher levels of homogeneity and consent, are capable of doing more things. And as you abstract up the chain, it becomes more and more impractical and more divisive to do more things. In my view, government is basically there to preserve certain key liberties. Those key liberties pre-exist the government insofar as they are more important than what priorities the government has. The job of government is to maintain, for example, national
Parece un Porsche
defense,
por detrás.
protection of property rights,
Está bien raro.
freedom. These are the key
No soy
focuses
fan
of government as
del diseño.
generally expressed in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. And I agree
Vamos a
with
hacer
the
este
general
primer
philosophy of the Bill
campeonato.
of Rights
10
and the
puntitos.
Constitution. Now that doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't do more on a government
Vamos por ese
level.
pinche
Again, as you get closer
Lincoln
to the
Company,
ground,
ese
which,
SUV.
by the way,
Sí,
is also
bueno.
embedded in the Constitution. People forget the Constitution was originally applied to the federal government, not to local and state government. But
Está grande el sedán.
if I'm going to define conservatism, it would actually be a little broader than that, because I think to understand how people interact with government and get kind of core values.
Pursuit of
And so for me,
perfection.
there are a couple of premises.
Búsqueda de la
One, human beings have a
perfección.
nature. That nature is neither good or bad. We have
Vamos en
aspects
el
of goodness and we have aspects of
2015.
badness. Human beings are sinful. We have temptations. And
Nice.
what that
Cuando vean mi
means
coche,
is that
uf,
we
van a
have to be
caer.
careful not to incentivize the bad, and that we should incentivize the good. Human beings do have agency and are capable of making decisions in the vast majority of circumstances, and it is better for society if we act as though they do. Second, the basic idea of human nature. There is an idea, in my view, that all human beings have equal value before the law. I'm a religious person, so I'd say equal value before God, but I think that's also sort of a key tenet of Western civilization, being non-religious or religious, that every individual has equivalent value in sort of cosmic terms. But that does not necessarily mean that every person is equally equipped to do everything equally
Chéquense.
well. And so
Ese
it's not
perro
the
tiene el
job of
del
government
DLC.
to rectify every imbalance of life. The quest for cosmic justice, as
Eso
Thomas
es
Sowell
pobre.
suggests, is something the government is generally incapable of doing, and more often than not botches and makes things worse. So those are a few key tenets, and that tends to materialize in a variety of ways. The easiest way to sum that up was the traditional kind of three legs, the conservative stool, although now obviously there's a very fragmented conservative movement in the United States, would be a socially conservative view in which family is the chief institution of society, platoons of society, as that term suggested. Free market and rights are extraordinarily valuable and necessary, because every individual has the ability to be property, freely alienate
Ya bueno que
property.
metieron el Prius al
And finally, I tend toward a hawkish foreign policy that suggests that the world is not filled with wonderful people who all agree with us and think like us, and those people will pursue adversarial interests if we do not protect our own interests.
Can I ask a question on that? So,
Yes.
Obviously, I have those conversations I consider to be really intelligent. But I feel like sometimes there are ways that conservatives talk about certain issues that seem to defy logic and experience. So here, and I'm sure you feel the same way about progressive politics. But even some liberals, for sure. Before I ask this question, it's going to relate to education. We can agree, broadly speaking, that statistics are real and that not everybody could do everything. So for a grounded example, my life was pretty
Vamos,
bad.
fueron
I got
cuatro.
into
Digo,
streaming
eso-
and I turned my life around, and that was really cool. But I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a streamer.
Well, of course, everybody has different challenges.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 20, 21. And one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in, I guess, in society came when it came time to deal with my son at the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could do private education. Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska lived very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district, a house there, I moved there, and my son was going to go to those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in first grade, they've got like huge computer labs and everything. Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools and if they just have better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members of society? Like a little bit of how they could actually achieve more and do better.
So I think that on the list of priorities when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure. The two things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning.
I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households.
Sure.
Communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one decisive according to prior and many studies done on that. It's pretty high. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources, is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, an enormous amount of money went to LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student, and it does not result in better schooling outcomes. And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite, every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize.
Mira, lo bueno de estar solo es que si gano los siguientes dos,
depende in terms of the means with which you are seeking them.
Eso es bueno.
And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that, again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure, and I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households, right? We can't bring it.
I totally agree with you.
So
that's why I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it pre-exists now.
Sure, but then I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like breakfast and lunch that's provided at school, like increased educational outcomes. Now I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, well, 20% of kids were graduating and now 80% of kids are graduating. Or these kids are all going, from their GEDs into the workforce and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch and breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these baseline.
So, again, I'm going to put a little premise to the question, because I think when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement? Right? So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitates that,
le metí, pero no le metí
communities take
tanto en
ownership of
cuanto a
their schools that they
desempeño,
want,
metí
right?
pura
All of these
estética.
issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And
Esto
so in a
meterle
vacuum,
más en
you say
desempeño
air
estaría
conditioning and lunch program sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. I mean, I've talked before, pretty controversially, about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. An enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I would love to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every gnat with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there is a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address.
That's not a conservative merry-go-round. I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that like there is a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children, and then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth control, so that people don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married, and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity.
No,
well, it's not.
No, just two-parent households. That's
but
it.
like, what are the precursors?
Don't fuck people before you're married and have babies.
Sure.
Done.
That's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but people will have sex and people will make babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly. That is obviously a societal change. Something changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is going to be increasingly important.
So, in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education.
I'm saying that one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's willing to get married is how much money both people are making if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out, and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. That is, by the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yes, 100%. Do we think a child deserves a mother and a father? Sure. That is the basis for all of this, including education.
Do we think that shotgun marriages are... Well, let's say this. Do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this like...
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
A ver, déjame ver porque era clasificación A. A ver, vamos a ver, déjame ver el...
I don't think we've ever like regressed social standards back to like, oh, well, let's go 100 years back to do things that,
Lexus LFA, pero no te dice requerimiento.
The Roe vs. Wade is not a social standard, it's a Supreme Court ruling. Yes. One. But number two, if you read the actual majority of opinion on Roe v. Wade, we can see that socially we actually never
Cualquiera de
made
esos
progress
dos.
on how society views abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive. Right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past, and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic.
The notion that the arc of history constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
What do we mean by that?
I mean,
in terms of women's rights, civil rights,
barbarism, communism, Nazism, all of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism weren't a regression from what was going on in 1905.
These are, in terms of like communism being a regression, for instance, I'm not a communist, but like the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened.
¿Me va a quitar el body kit?
The industrialization.
Murder of dead people.
Para performance nada más.
Moral regression, which is what we are talking about now, moral regression. And you're suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term a return to traditional values a moral regression, you would. But your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction, and I am suggesting that history does not only move in one direction, it tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars, there are going to be times of peace. I think in general we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past. But I think when we look at the way that people live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism, or when it comes to slavery, or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the US, and one is access to contraception, and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all, what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage. It's the opposite. Usually
those women are not educated, but those women are getting shotgun marriages. Those women are having children.
Yeah, but now you're shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married. And what I've been suggesting, and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more seriously.
There's another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages, and there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage, and that is
Madres.
Thing that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids. I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't think it's unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school, if we could provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that would be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem that has so many.
I am fine within my local community. We all vote. Again, I've suggested there's a difference between local community and federal. I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agree to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest, and the more interest you have in your neighbors. All of that's fine. I'm part of a very, very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them, and we just ignore that.
Cero. De hecho, si sirve lo voy a compartir de una vez para el dinero.
We're never going to get married again. Well, I mean, actually, what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. The demographic profile, actually, over time, is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married. I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. That's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay, and so what's happening, actually, in terms of demographics, is that the people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically, over time, long periods of time, not over one generation,
Vamos a ver
over
qué tal se
long periods of
desempeña.
time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. I'm just saying that,
Tres
again,
minutos.
on the, I hear when I bring up the term merry-go-round, I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive in society, etc., etc. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without like fixing
In
something.
what way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine with people voting for
Yeah, but so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioning?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that, per se. I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem.
Sure,
and I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, closing their sex life to one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community. Like the things that actually build society. I'm fine with arguing about each of these policies, and whether we apply them or not is a matter generally of pragmatism, not morality. It's a matter of incentive structures, not per se morality. Because incentive structures have moral underpinnings. There's such a thing as, for example, welfare program. You have to decide how effective it is, what crowd it applies, where the cutoffs are. Does it disincentivize work? Does it not? All of these are pragmatic concerns. On a moral level, the generalized objection that I have to people on the left side of the aisle is that they like to focus. In these conversations, very often it feels as though it's a conversation that people are drunk searching under the lamp for their keys. Problems they want to look at are problems that are solved by government. And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark, and not particularly solved by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. But then obviously my criticism for the conservative side is the exact opposite, where there are parts where government could remedy some issues. For instance, children having sex with each other, producing other children out of wedlock. Like sometimes having after-school programs is nice to prevent that. Like I didn't have time for these things when I was in school. I was doing football practice. I was doing cross-country practice. I went in early for a band. I agree with you that sometimes people only focus on one end of the problem. I hate to be that guy, but as somebody that have you ever watched The Wire? Sure. I'm not going to cite The Wire as real life example, but obviously there's only so much you can do in a school when the children coming in are so beyond destroyed because of the parents and everything prior to them even getting to school that day. So I agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families.
And it's actually not the solution to education, depending on the kind of solution. about some solutions, yes, some solutions, no.
Yeah. So the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make? Because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at things. There are marginal costs and marginal utility things where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra $20,000 after.
Yeah, I think these are all pragmatic discussions.
Sure,
and actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
As we descend from the heavens of philosophical discussion of conservatism and liberalism, let's go to the pragmatic muck of politics. Trump versus Biden. Between the two of them, who was, in their first term, the better president? And thus, who should win if the two of them are, in fact, our choices, should win a second term in 2024?
Mierda, tío.
Ben?
Sure. So, in terms of actual job performance, you have to separate it into a few categories. In terms of actual performance in foreign policy, I think Trump's foreign policy record is significantly better than Biden's, the world being on fire right now being a fairly good example of that. And we can get into each aspect of the world being on fire and where the incentive structures came from and how all of that happened in a moment. When it comes to the economy, I think that Trump's economic record was better than Biden's. Doesn't mean he didn't overspend. He did. He wildly overspent.
Vamos a darle.
He also
Es el único que
had
tiene
a very
dragoncito
solid
rojo.
record of job creation. A huge percentage of the gains in the economy went to people on the lower end of the economic road. Actually, the gross income to the average American was about $6,000 for each term. You know, when rates were very, very low before COVID.
No mames,
And
esto
I
trae
think that you
esto.
almost have to separate the Trump administration before COVID and during COVID, because COVID obviously is sort of a black swan event, the most single change in politics in our lifetime. And so, you know, his governance during COVID is almost its own category, which we can discuss. But, you know, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, I think that Trump is significantly better than Biden has been, and that's on the upside for Trump. On the downside for Biden, obviously you're talking about your highs in inflation, you're talking about saving being eaten away, you're talking about everything being 20 to 30% more expensive, you're talking about massive increases in deficit and the rate that was unknown under Trump. Deficit under Trump raised by about a little under $1 trillion every year up until 2020. Again, 2020 was COVID year, so everybody decided that we're going to fire hose money at things. But then Joe Biden continued to fire hose money at things in 21, 22, and 23. That obviously is, in my opinion, bad economic policy. And then you get to the rhetoric, and you get to the stuff that Donald Trump says. And as I've said before, my view is that on Donald Trump's epitaph, on his gravestone, it will say Donald Trump. He said a lot of shit. I think that Donald Trump does say a lot of things. I think that that is basically baked into the cake, which is why everyone is bewildered by the polls is ignoring human nature, which is, at the beginning, when you see something very shocking, it's very shocking, and then if you see it over and over and over and over for years on end, it is no longer shocking. It is just part of the background noise, like tinnitus. It becomes, you know, something that your brain
Vamos perdiendo
adjusts
otra
for.
puta vez.
And so, do I like a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric? No, and I never have. Do I think that that is as positive as to his presidency? No, I do not. When it comes to Biden, again, I think he's underperforming economically. I think his foreign policy has been really a problem. Even the things I think he's done right are, I think, band-aids for things that
No mames, así
and
de
when it comes to
fácil.
his own rhetoric, you can argue that it's grading on a curve, because Trump is coming in with such wild rhetoric that that wild rhetoric doesn't really change again the baseline. For Biden, he came in the same way that Obama does, for the rhetoric of American unity and president. Like Trump came in, he's like, listen, I'm the president for what I am, and you know, I'm going to say the things I want to say. I'm going to be on the toilet next week. We're like, okay, you know, so that's what it is. With Biden, he came in with, I'm the president for all Americans, I'm trying to unify everybody, and that pretty quickly broke down into a lot of oppositional language about his political opponents in particular, an attempt to lump in, for example, huge swaths of the conservative movement with the people who participated, for example, in January 6th, or were fans of January 6th. You know, the sort of lumping in of everybody into bad Republicans wasn't personally signed on to an infrastructure bill with him. That sort of stuff, I think, has been truly terrible. I thought his Philadelphia speech was truly terrible. And again, I think that you do have the problem of he is no longer capable of
Esta cabrona tunda que nos están dando, güey. ¿Qué
every
con
speech
esta?
that feels like watching Nick Melinda walk across volcano. It really is like you're
Está
just
muy
sort of
baja la
waiting for
velocidad
it
de
to
este
fall.
vehículo,
I mean,
cabrón. Déjate el control.
it's sad to say,
Está
I mean,
muy
the other day,
lento.
speaking
What the
for
fuck?
what was, in effect, his campaign kickoff, and this is in Valley Forge, and I mean, Jill rushed up there, like, as soon as he was done, Jill rushed up there, you know, like she'd been shot out of a cannon to come and try and guide him away so he didn't go through, and, you know, that's not really, you know, let's put it this way, it does not quiet the soul to watch Joe Biden rhetorically. Again, that's a different problem than Trump's problem, but that's my analysis.
This is one of the areas where we get into this. I don't understand if there's like brain breaking happening or what's going on. I don't know what world we can ever live in where we say that Trump is less divisive for the country than Biden. I think it is so patently obvious. Trump is so divisive. Like, not only does Trump make an enemy out of every person in the opposition party, he makes an enemy out of his own party and every single person around him. Like, we all watched him bully, Jeff Sessions. We all watched him bully his own party on Twitter. We all watched all of these people walk away from him. Even recently, I think the Secretary of Defense Esper and John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, were saying, I think Trump is a threat to democracy. You've got all of his prior people that were around him, some of his closest allies. You've got Bill Barr that won't co-sign a single heads. You've got all these people that he used to work with that all say Trump is a horrible, evil person. He is ineffective as a leader. He doesn't accomplish anything, and he didn't. To say that Biden has failed at bipartisanship when, we've got the CHIPS Act, we've got the IRA, we've got the ARP, we've got the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we've got all this major legislation that is working in this historically divided Congress, as opposed to Trump that got us tax cuts and deficit spending. I don't understand where we ever are in this world where Biden is somehow more divisive than Trump. Even the speeches that is bringing up, they always bring up, I remember that one, I think we might have even done it on our episode, though. The one speech that Biden gave where at one point the background is red.
And Philly speaker reference.
Yeah, they're like, oh my God, it's over, this is the end. And then meanwhile you got Donald Trump, coming into office saying things like, if you burn the flag, you should have your citizenship. Or talking about DNC, that I'm going to investigate every single one of these media organizations for corruptness. I'm going to open the libel and defamation laws. I'm going to take all of these guys to court. You've got this new Project 2025 stuff where John Paschal, I think, is talking about, we're gonna investigate all of these people and we're gonna try to throw crimes at all these people. Trump is like the most divisive president I think we've ever had in at least in my lifetime of being an American citizen. And the rhetoric from him is it's on a whole other level in terms of the demonization of political opponents. I mean, this is a guy that's known for giving his political opponents bad nicknames, right? Like, that's what Trump does. It's funny, but even as a resident of Florida, if Florida had another natural disaster, do you think Trump would withhold aid? Because you had, I think that was one of the few nice things that DeSantis actually said about Biden, was they're like, hey, listen, when the buildings collapsed in, I think that was in Miami Beach, yeah, and, for the hurricane stuff, that Biden was there, he was saying, if you guys can aid, billions, you can have it. Meanwhile, Trump, I think, was threatening to withhold federal funding from blue states that wouldn't, I think it had to do with the National Guard stuff, the deployment of the National Guard, that they weren't doing enough for the riots, and Trump was threatening to withhold aid from some of these blue states. Trump is literally the most divisive person in the world. I don't see how on any metric he is ever succeeding in the divisive category. In terms of the economy, I do think it's funny that Republicans are very keen to say that, we can't really grade Trump, post-COVID, because obviously COVID messed everything up, which is fair, but pre-COVID, what did Trump do? He did deficit spending, tax cuts. He presided over historic low interest rates and an economy that was already blazing past the final years of Obama. We were posting all-time highs on all the stock markets in 2013 onwards. Unemployment rates were falling. Now under Biden, unemployment rates are even lower than they were under Trump. But it sucks that for Trump we can say, well, we can't really hold him accountable for 2020. That was COVID. Sure. Well, all we have for Biden is post-COVID. We don't have any pre-COVID Biden. Economy. And it was the same thing for Obama, too, coming in right after the housing collapse as well. And it sucks that Republicans are able to walk out of office, having burned the entire American society to the ground economically, and now we've got to try to evaluate, okay, well, what did Obama do during his first 2 to 3 to 4 years just trying to recover from where the housing crash left it? And then we look at Biden now, who's trying to recover from COVID, and now we're grading him on a totally different scale than what Trump is being graded on. Yeah, that sucks, I think. We can
comment on the foreign policy.
On the foreign policy, I'm going to be honest, I am very liberal, very not progressive. I'll probably come off as more hawkish than others because I'm not a big fan of this, which also, if Ben agrees, I think people like Trump are going to be the most dovish, isolationist people ever. They don't want to do anything internationally. They just want to, protect America, be at home, protect our economy, don't do anything internationally, which is why he was constantly undermining NATO and constantly, attacking all the European Union and, cheering on the UK for Brexiting away from the EU. I think that being said, I think that Biden's done a phenomenal job when it comes to foreign policy. I think that the coalition building was so important for Ukraine, Russia, and I'm so happy that he decided to go to our European allies and our NATO allies and try to build a coalition of people to help Ukraine so that that wasn't only the United States. Personally, especially after doing a whole bunch of research, I do tend to side with Israel over Palestine in a lot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. I'm glad that Biden, while remaining a staunch defender of Israel, is trying to rein in some of the more aggressive posturing towards the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I'm proud that Biden said, hey, listen, we're going to delay some of these attacks. Hey, listen, we are going to allow humanitarian aid here. Hey, listen, we are going to try to, not kill as many Palestinian people down there, while still, signaling that he would be a staunch supporter of Israel in the conflict, assuming the civilian casualties don't go too high. For foreign policy, blemishes. The biggest one you can give to Biden is Afghanistan and the pullout there. But man, are we going to talk about, the Inspector General report that says that one of the biggest reasons why the Afghanistan pullout was so disastrous was because of the Doha Accords, where Donald Trump headed talks that didn't even include the Afghanistan army? These were disasters. Like when Biden took office, we had 2,500 troops left in Afghanistan. Like, what was the options even afforded to Biden at that point? Obviously, you've got the abandonment of the Kurds in northern Syria, for the Turkish armies to lay waste to. Talking about Iran and North Korea, although I'm not sure where Ben would land on those, but yeah, that's broadly. Yeah.
That's a lot from both. You want to pick at something where you disagree with here?
Well, there's a lot. So, I want to ask a few questions on each one of these.
Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about divisiveness for a second. So, there's no one who can make the case that Donald Trump is not divisive.
Yeah.
Of course, he's incredibly divisive. It's a given. Do you treat Biden's rhetoric with the same level of seriousness that you treat Trump's rhetoric? Or I should put that the other way around. Should we treat Trump's rhetoric with the same level of seriousness as Joe Biden or, say, Barack Obama's rhetoric?
I'm going to try to be concise in my answers. Broadly speaking, especially in studying Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia, I try not to take politicians at their word, because sometimes they just say stuff to say stuff. I understand that. But broadly speaking, I'm going to look at the rhetoric and the actions, and I am going to grade them the same. So yes, I would hold Biden and Trump to the same standard.
Right. So my feeling is, in this one area where, for clarification, we're going to have a division, is that I, of course, don't treat Trump's rhetoric in the same way that I treat Biden's or Obama's. He's utterly uncalibrated, and he says whatever he wants to at any given time, and it doesn't even match up with his policy very often.
Can I ask you, for our head of state, our chief executive, shouldn't rhetoric be arguably one of the most important things that he does?
The answer would be yes, and now I've been given a choice between a person who I think in calibrated ways says things that are divisive and a person who in uncalibrated ways says things that are divisive. And so the evidence that Joe Biden is divisive is every poll taken since essentially August of 2021. He is, by all available metrics, incredibly divisive. A huge percentage of Americans are deeply unhappy, not only with his performance, but don't believe he's a uniter. That's just the reality, and that may just be a reflection. Honestly, we may be putting too much on Trump or Biden personally. It may just be that the American people themselves are rhetorically divided because of social media, and social media can, in fact, be a cesspool.
One thing that I would ask you about that, though,
Sure.
is I agree, especially when you look at the favorability, but sometimes when I look at these polls, when you start to disaggregate them by party, I wonder if it's actually, is Biden historically divisive, or, I'm trying to think of a really polite way to say this, the people that like Trump worship Trump. I don't know. One of the most prescient things that Trump could have probably ever said was that I could kill someone on 5th Street and nobody would hold me accountable. So is it really that Biden is historically divisive, or is it that every single Trump supporter will always say that Trump is great? And
the reason I would say that Biden is, in fact, historically divisive is because Republicans felt much more strongly about Barack Obama than Joe Biden, actually.
But they didn't feel as strongly about Trump as they did about, Romney or McCain.
In what way?
Yo creo que este es el que vamos a usar.
There's certainly more allegiance to Trump than there is to Romney or McCain, largely because Trump won in 2016. But beyond that, the point that I'm making is that if you're looking at the stats in terms of divisiveness, Republicans always find the Democrats divisive. The question is where the rest of the country is. And right now, there are a lot of Democrats who either don't agree with Biden or find him divisive. There are a lot of independents who find him divisive. So when we're comparing these things, I don't think they're leagues apart in terms of the divisive effect of what they say. Right, and I'm separating that off from the inherent content of what they say, because obviously what Trump says is more divisive just on the raw level. If he's insulting people as opposed to Joe Biden doing MAGA Republicans, if I were an alien come down from space and look at these two statements, I'd say this one's more divisive than this one. But then there's the reality of being a human being in the world, and that is everyone has baked Donald Trump into the cake. And Joe Biden, again, started off with a patina of being non-divisive and now has emerged as divisive. If you don't mind, I actually want to get to the foreign policy questions because this one is actually slightly less interesting to me.
Sure. Just one quick thing, I guess, because we can say the reality of it, and we can look at opinion polls. What if we look at legislative accomplishments? Biden is working on a 50-50 divided Senate. Donald Trump had both houses of Congress. But prior to that, because we got the infrastructure bill, I think, in 1 year, which Trump promised for his entire presidency.
Well, yes, his Republican base was not in favor of mass spending on infrastructure, and neither am I. So there's that. I think that's mostly a state and local issue.
But they were in favor of mass spending for tax cuts?
That's not spending.
Effectively it is, right?
Effectively it's not.
Well, if you're cutting tax receipts, but you're not changing the level of spending, like Biden did with the IRA.
We have a fundamental philosophical difference here. I think that when the government takes my money, that is not the government somehow being more fiscally responsible. And when the government allows me to keep my money, I don't see that as the government spending. I see that as my money, and the government is taking less of it.
That's great, but at the end of the day, the government is still going to be in a deficit spending, and they're going to have to borrow money from the Treasury.
Right, we have a spending problem. In other words, not a receipts problem, is the case that I'm making. The problem with Donald Trump is not that he lowered taxes. The United States has one of the most progressive tax systems on the planet, and in fact, if you wish to have a European-style social welfare state, what you actually need is to tax the middle class to death. And the reality is that the top 20% of the American population pays literally all net taxes in the United States after state benefits and all of this.
Sure.
So if you actually wanted to have the kind of social welfare state that many liberals seem to want to have, like Northern Europe, for example, you'd actually have to tax people who make $40,000, $50,000, $60,000.
And I don't want that. I agree with that. But how do you explain the lack of legislation? I mean, if he's such a uniter.
Because I think the Republican Party itself is quite divided, and I think that Trump's...
But isn't that his job? He's the head of the Republican Party. He's the Republican president of the United States.
I mean, again, I don't think that Joe Biden has passed wildly historic legislation.
The infrastructure bill was the largest,
here's the problem. If you're a Republican, the only bills that you can get consensus on tend to be bills that either... that let's be real about this, that are tax cuts because, as you would, I think, agree with, when it comes to polling data, Americans constantly say they want to cut the government, and then the minute you ask them which program, they have no idea what they're right, exactly. And so it's much harder to come up with a bill to cut things than it is to come up with a bill to add things, which is why spending was out of control under Trump as well. But there are some Republicans who still don't want to spend on those things, right? So inherently, the task that this goes back to the first question. The task that Republicans think government is there to do is different than the task that Democrats think that government is there to do. So the way that the very metric of success for a Democratic president versus a Republican president, namely, for example, pieces of legislation passed, as a Republican, one of my goals is to pass nearly no legislation because I don't actually want the government involved in more areas of our life. I want to ask a couple questions on the foreign policy. Sure.
Yeah, okay, wait, real quick. So, for instance, Donald Trump wanted to punish China, and he wanted to bring microprocessor manufacturing to the United States. Biden did that with legislation, with the CHIPS Act. You talk about spending being out of control, and I mean, I can agree with that. I think anybody who looks at the numbers has to agree with that. But why not pass legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is at least spending neutral? Right? Why are there not bills where Donald Trump could take...
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that whenever the government says something is spending neutral, it rarely materializes that way. That is not going to be a spending neutral bill.
Sure, but there's a difference between, at least they say it's spending neutral versus the, say, $500 billion bill over, 10 years.
But again, I don't see a tax cut as a matter of, quote, spending neutrality. The big problem is they keep spending, not that they are allowing me to keep the money that I earn and they did not earn.
No puedo creer que esta madre al final resulte más potente en 800 que el otro en 800. Es como, wey, what the hell?
They didn't change spending at all. You wouldn't consider that an increase in deficit spending or out of control spending. You would just say...
Hay que ver eso cómo reacciona. Yo lo sentí mejor, mucho mejor. Fujitsubo, saludos a Fujitsubo. Pues es el único con el... Ah, no, ahí hay otro con el SS. SSC.
COVID ended effectively, I mean, you live in Florida, COVID effectively ended in the state of Florida by the middle of 2021.
Yeah,
I mean, even if you're a vaccine fan, by April, May of 2021, there was wide availability of vaccines, whether or not you like the vaccines.
Yeah.
And at that point, we were done.
I agree, but we're in a post, how many trillions of dollars have been dumped in worldwide that are leading to inflation, right? The inflation is a worldwide issue right now because of the economy shutting down for a year or two. It's not like those effects are gone in 1 year, right? COVID might be gone, but the after effects of all the stimulus spending and the unemployment and everything else.
The definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So pouring more money on top of that makes for more inflation. That's what it does.
Sure, I agree. But there's also the definition of when do you deficit spend is when economies are headed for recessions, right? Rather than when economies are doing really well, like they were under Trump, and he was deficit spending. Whereas Biden can at least make the argument that I
se siente más cómodo acelerar.
I don't think that the economy is actually headed for recession. If you look at the economic statistics. No,
They're still saying that there's like a recession.
right, but that was largely because of the after-effects of inflation, meaning if you inflate the economy, what you're going to end up doing is bursting a bubble, and then when that bubble bursts, you'll get
No te
recession.
quieren dar ese pinche LFA, güey. Pinche carrera difícil.
If you actually look at, for example, the employment statistics, it looked like under the last year's Obama and then Trump, it looks like this, and then it gets March of 2020, it goes like that,
Yeah.
and then by like September, it bounces back up, right? It's a V-shaped recovery, and then it starts to peter out.
A lot because of the American Recovery Plan, right?
I mean,
4 million jobs.
no, I'm not going to attribute it to that because the rates of growth in job growth from September, October, November were actually very similar to the rates of job growth after Joe Biden took office. What you see is actually kind of a straight line.
Estamos muy en primer lugar, pero
Like you said, on the foreign policy stuff, this is getting abstruse, but on the foreign
Take
policy
over.
stuff, so the questions that I have with regard to Biden on foreign policy,
quiero hit him off, pero no puedo, güey.
very, very simple question. Do you think the situation is better now than it was under Donald Trump?
Backwards that I'm making right now are like obviously you've got the Israel-Palestinian war that's going on right now, which is kind of bad. But like broadly speaking, I'm not sure how much that affects the Middle East as much as like the collapse of Syria. 2013 Syrian civil war sent millions of immigrants throughout all of Europe,
Which was under
Obama and continued under Trump. Even Syria is part.
Why did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia again?
How did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia?
Yes, why did it end up being essentially a client state of Russia?
I know that Putin enjoys access to ports down there. I don't know.
I mean, the reason is because Barack Obama suggested that there was a red line that would be drawn in the face of chemical weapons use. Bashar Assad then used chemical weapons in Syria, and Barack Obama was unwilling to then essentially create consequences for Syria in the form of any sort of Western strike, and so instead he outsourced it to Russia. This is 2013, 2014.
Do you think there might have been some hesitancy after like seeing how Libya ended up that maybe us like intervening
Was
or
President during
¡No mames! ¡Oh, la mierda!
The point that I'm making is that actually the Middle East, I mean, just historically speaking, was historically good under Donald. It's very difficult to make a case. And either before or after Trump were better than during Trump.
Was it just, I mean, the Syrian, I don't think that Trump contributed to the Syrian situation improving much. I think
he
he caught a lot of...
He did wreck ISIS, which was in the...
I mean, ISIS has been getting wrecked by the Kurds in Iraq, by every single person, by Assad's army, by Putin, by Turkey. Literally everybody was fighting against ISIS at that point.
And there's spiking violence, and then the Trump... I mean, you get credit for when you're president, presumably. I mean, things got better with ISIS under Trump.
I mean, yeah, they did. I mean,
Things got worse with ISIS under Obama.
For sure.
He called them the JV squad.
Sure.
And then they became not the JV squad.
Yeah, but
And
I
then
don't know
they
if
ended
ISIS is
under Trump.
originating in Syria and Baghdad and all the growth of that isn't necessarily Obama's fault. I know that we like to say that
Tercer intento y valió verga.
I don't know if you say that, but I've heard that saying a lot. I think that's a little bit simplistic. I don't think that when I'm looking at like actions that presidents have taken, the biggest criticism I have for like Middle Eastern policy is I think the Doha Accords were a disaster, and I think that's like one of the biggest blemishes that we have right now. I would also argue that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was also kind of silly, and arguably contributed to some of the conflict we see right now.
No, exactly. I'll argue precisely the opposite, especially given the fact that after the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords continued to sign and actually expand. And that if Donald Trump had been elected, I have no doubt in my mind that Saudi Arabia would now be a part of the Abraham Accords. In fact, that was basically pre-negotiated. And then when Joe Biden took office, Joe Biden took a very anti-Saudi stance on a wide variety of issues. The biggest single effect in the Middle East of Joe Biden's presidency, and again, I agree with you that not every foreign policy issue can be laid at the hands of a president. Joe Biden's main approach to the Middle East was very similar to the Obama approach, which is why the Middle East was chaotic under Obama and chaotic under Biden. And that was to alienate allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and instead to try to make common cause or cut deals with Iran.
Que la verga, güey, ¿por qué me empujas?
In an attempt to avoid what Biden actually was trying to do, which was good, which was failure with Saudi Arabia, trying to bring them into the Abraham Accords, right? That was what was burgeoning at the end of last year. And Iran saw that, and Iran decided that they were going to throw a grenade into the middle of those negotiations by essentially activating Hamas. Hamas activates, Hamas commits October 7th. Israel, as a sovereign nation state, has to respond to the murder of 1,200 of its citizens and the taken kidnapping of 140. Israel has to do that not only to go after its own hostages and try to restore them, but also to reestablish military deterrence in the most violent region of the world. Hezbollah gets active on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. They get active on the northern border. The Houthis in Yemen get active. The only reason all this is happening at the same time is because Iran is doing this. And not just that, they are threatening global shipping. You're talking about the effects of global supply lines, which I totally agree have a major inflationary effect on the economy thanks to COVID. Right now, the cost of shipping is nearly double what it was just a few weeks ago, and that is because a ragtag group, the barbarians, are attacking international shipping and forcing everybody to stop Bab el-Mandeb Strait instead of going around the Cape in Africa. All of that is the result of the fact that Joe Biden reoriented the United States in the very early days in favor of a more pro-Iranian stance.
Hijo de su perra madre, tira, güey.
Turns out, proxies in many of his aides were actually administration literally one of the first act was to deal with terror organization and sanctions against the Houthis. These are all moves that Biden made very early on. They were disastrous moves. But when it comes to domestic policy,
¿por qué pido tracción ahí?
Sure. So just a couple of Middle Eastern things. So one of the big things that threw the Middle East into disaster was we are all traumatized by it now.
La verga, güey, el grip aquí. La dificultad de estas carreras no está fácil, no sé. Estos cabrones de Forza no quieren soltar otro pinche LFA, güey. Ay, cabrón. Estuvo buena esta carrera, estuvo buena. Special guest, Prof of Chaos.
Until Bush, for whatever reason, decides to throw Iran into the axis of evil.
It needs to be that we were on the road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
We do in the wait what?
That we were on the road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
My understanding is that from the late 90s and
¿ganamos?
Labeling of Iran, that there was going to be some path forward to where we could start to.
Very difficult to believe. I think we just disagree.
What?
Sure, we can disagree on that, but I know that
the after effects, just a quick note, the after effect of the Iraq war that was the most devastating was the increase in power of Iran.
I agree, because of the destabilization of
Yes.
Iraq. And Iraq not having a government there that was functional for at least a decade.
It was in fact a Sunni government, right? Originally it was a Sunni government. Disbanding the Sunni army was one of the worst things that the Bush administration did.
Banning all the former Ba'ath parties,
sectarian.
Cabrón. Eso, ya tenemos el Lincoln Company 02HB, güey. Hatchback. No es una mini SUV, es una hatchback. Nice. Soy fan de los hatchback. Y aparte tenemos otro LFA, Buena, ¿no? Ahora vamos al Lexus. Espera. Ahí está el LFA. Bonito.
I think that Iran is a major problem. However, I don't know if the path
Aquí está el
forward
hatchback.
is constantly being belligerent to Iran or trying to figure out some road to normalcy. I don't know if the collapse of Iran or the destruction of that country, considering how unpopular the Ayatollah even is there. Like the citizens of Iran, I don't think are big supporters of the government there. I feel like moving on a path where, let's do nuclear inspections. We had that Iranian nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. Let's do the nuclear inspections. Make sure you're not on the way to nuclear weapons. Let's unfreeze some funds. Let's move in some direction where we get on a good term with you. I feel like that's the most important thing that needs to happen in the Middle East. As much as people like to look at the Abraham Accords, who cares if, what was it, Bahrain, I think Oman, I think
UAE and Morocco.
The UAE and Morocco, are like all of these people, even Saudi Arabia, already have like de facto normalization.
Perro, el downshift te saca flamitas.
To pretend that anybody, years ago, talking about normalization, Saudi Arabia and Israel, they've already on that path.
Las calaveras me recuerdan a la Peugeot.
They've already been collaborating and doing
wild claim that Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to normalize 15 years ago.
15 years ago might have been a wild claim.
That's
but after Turkey, after Jordan, and then in the past 20 years of economic relations and ties with each other, all of the leadership in the Middle East, and you'll agree with this, look at Israel and they go, okay, well we've got Palestinians who, God bless them, do nothing, and then you've got Israel, which is on a region with no natural resources to somehow become like an economic giant. They're good to trade with. Their population's educated. They have military power.
Vamos a hacer estas ya, pero no, todavía no. Vamos a hacer otra cosa. Vamos a hacer estos speed zones. Vamos a hacer los campeonatos de una vez. Nissan Infinity clase 800. Nissan Infinity clase 800. A ver, ¿tengo algún Nissan Infinity clase 800? Sí.
is
But do we think
absolutely benign.
Are the is it
esta
the
madre está
Abraham
bien.
Accords that's convincing Saudi Arabia to take a stance?
Déjame ver un Nissan.
No, I mean,
No,
Saudi
they're
Arabia.
already fighting. Yeah, they're already fighting with each other, right? Like, I don't think the Abraham Accords moved us any closer towards
Bueno.
any type of real peace in the region. The point has to happen.
Vamos a transportarnos hasta
There
allá.
has to be some diplomatic bilateral communication.
Podré conduciendo hacia allá, pero
What was in which was what was taking place with the increased normalization.
tracción delantera. No me gusta eso, pero chingo de hatchback son tracción delantera también, entonces pues ahí
Foreign policy circles that diplomacy can sort of be wish cast out of thin air. If you sit around a table, that you can always come to an agreement with somebody. The Ayatollahs do not have common interests with the United States. They do not. And this idea that they are willing to take money in exchange for example, some sort of peaceful acquiescence to Israel's existence is obviously untrue.
Hasn't that been the case, though? That you've had a region with tons of sectarian violence for a long time, and then finally Turkey was like, you know what, this isn't worth it. The United States paid them a lot of money. They had conversations with Israel. You know what, the economy, the economic gain.
bonito color también.
But the situation with Turkey was actually quite warm between Israel and Turkey in the 90s when you had the sort of secular Muslim regime
in the 90s, but they signed
Turk in place, and now Erdogan has joined in the fray. Erdogan is significantly more radical.
Sure. Then why? I'm so sorry. If I said Turkey, I meant Egypt. My bad.
Yeah. No, okay. So yeah. Right. So
in terms of like Egypt and Jordan, right, were the first two.
Here's the thing. Is it possible that you could theoretically come to a deal with Iran only with a new leadership group? It's true for every peace agreement in the region. You could not. Israel could not have made peace with.
Well, they made peace with Egypt, and Sadat was the leader for Yom Kippur, right?
Right. The point is that this is a different
Bonito, bonito, me gusta el coche. Digo, es un auto chino stock, no es muy rápido, para nada, pero lo hace bien.
It is also true that is a relationship that could be cultivated specifically because
Anything goes.
it was Sadat who made clear he was going to come to the table. Have the
Interesante.
Iranians ever made clear that they would come to the
Le
table
di
for
solo,
example, the
bueno,
existence
que es de
of the state of
cooperativo.
Israel? No. That is not a thing that's going to happen. But I think
Bueno, no hace mucho que no hay uno solo, güey.
every one of them not only calls for
Vamos a hacer
the destruction of the state
uno
of Israel, they also
solo,
call for the
con más
destruction
carreras por
of
X.
America. I mean, it's literally the Houthis.
Mira, voy a dar
They're busy hitting ships, and their slogan is literally Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to the Jews, death to Israel. It doesn't fit our
Eso lo está diciendo
but
ese güey,
it's
yo
not
no.
all that catchy, but that is in fact their slogan. The notion that the regime that propagates that is going to be
Vamos a hacerlo con
diplomacy
Haikar primero.
is not only wrong, the problem is that it's easy to say that the stakes of diplomacy are okay, well, so we try to talk, right? Draw is better than war. Sure. The only problem is that in the Middle East, weakness is taken as a sign that aggression might be an appropriate response. That is how things work in the Middle East. And the fact that that Joe Biden came into office with an orientation toward continuing the Obama policies in Iran led to conflagration, brush fires breaking out everywhere. Iran has borders.
De primero empezamos con el circuito aquí. Emerald Circuit, creo que es esto.
The logic of violence in the Middle East is not quite the logic of violence in other places in the world. By the way, I think the logic of violence in the Middle East is actually closer to what most international politics looks like than the war. I mean, I think that's part of what's happening in Ukraine as well. So you think, which brings me, by the way, here's my question.
Esa ley.
So do you think that for Iran, right, a country that's been sanctioned for God knows how many years now, do you think that for Iran just continuing to sanction them is an effective way, is more effective than trying to engage them in bilateral and multilateral
Yes, 100%. Okay, the proof is in the pudding.
We'll go to Ukraine, can I ask about Israel? So you're both mostly in agreement. What is Israel?
I'd say that.
Okay, but as I'm learning, what is Israel doing right? What is Israel doing wrong in this very specific current war?
Ese coche está bien verga, 370.
What Israel's doing wrong is if I were Israel, okay, like America's interests are not coincident with Israel's interests. If I were an Israeli leader, I would have still gotten out and not leave out of Hezbollah early. What does that mean? So I would have. Yoav Gallant was the defense minister. Israel was encouraging Netanyahu as the prime minister, and the war cabinet, including Benny Gantz. So whenever people talk about
¿Qué son Z4? Ah, no, son infinitos. Son
war
infinitos.
government in place that includes the political government. The reason I point that out is that a lot of people politically will suggest that the actions Israel is currently taking are somehow the manifestation of right-wing government. Israel currently does not have a quote-unquote right-wing government. They have a unity government that includes the
Vamos por allá.
Yoav Gallant was urging in the very early days of the war that Israel should turn north instead of hitting Hamas. They should actually take the opportunity to knock Hezbollah out, because Hezbollah is significantly more dangerous to the existence of the state of Israel than Hamas. I actually agree with that. As far as what Israel has been doing wrong in the actual war, I think that, again, from an American perspective, I think that Israel is doing pretty well. From an Israeli perspective, if I were Israeli, I would actually want Israel to be less loose about sending its soldiers in on the ground level. So Israel is attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and the cost of that has been the highest military death toll that Israel has had since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. I mean, I personally know, through 1 degree of separation, 3 separate people who've been killed in Gaza. And that's because they're going in door to door, because they're attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and they're losing a lot of guys in this particular war. The problem that Israel has had, historically speaking, is that Israel got very complacent about its own security situation. They believed technology was going to somehow correct for the hatred on the other side of the wall. That so our people have to be around time, well, some rockets fall, but at least it's not a war. And that complacence.
Primera carga ganada, Misato. Mira esa belleza de nave. Hermoso vehículo. Me encanta. Me encanta. Es hermoso.
That's what I think Israel is doing wrong. I have a feeling there's a wide divergence.
Maybe. So, in terms of broadly speaking, I generally oppose settlement expansion. It's a thing that Israel does incorrectly that I think is kind of like provocative to at least all the Palestinians in the West Bank, and it probably energizes hatred in the Gaza Strip for them as well. In terms of conducting warfare, the one thing that I always say to everybody, especially Americans, is you can't evaluate things from an American perspective. It's very stupid. It happened a lot with Ukraine, where people are like, oh, well, didn't they work with the Nazis? And like, weren't the Soviets the good guys? And it's like, well, in other parts of the world, it's not quite as simple. And I think the same is true for Israel.
Continuemos. Ya hicimos con Haikar.
The conflict is just being one between
Vamos a darle con
which is not. It's a conflict between Israel and then Palestine, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and
Lokar.
Right now it is.
Vamos a darle con Lokar.
I think that however, one area where I'll break with Ben is I think that minimizing civilian casualties.
Me parece que debe ser un. Lokar está
bonito
también, güey. Haikar, Lokar, los dos la verdad les quedaron de puta madre.
I don't even think it matters for the international community. It definitely doesn't matter for the UN, because Jesus Christ.
Digo, obviamente Haikar tiene un Sea West, un Barik, pero
has gotten over the Palestinian issue. I think that leadership is kind of like, they don't care as much anymore. The populations still care quite a bit. And I think that the main issue that Israel could run into is if the civilian death toll does climb too high, and if they start to hit this 40, 50, 60,000 number of civilian casualties, they run the risk of the civilian populations in the surrounding Middle Eastern states so antagonistic towards Israel that they start to take steps back towards normalization in the region. So, for instance, I know that Bahrain, I think, already pulled out their ambassador to Israel. My guess is going to be it's temporary. I know that on the public speaking side, you've got a lot of people condemning Israel for the attacks. On the private side, you've got people telling Israel, please kill all of Hamas because this is untenable and nobody wants to work in this situation. I don't know if this ended up being true or not. I'm guessing it didn't. But I saw on a couple of Twitter accounts it was leaked that potentially Saudi Arabia was considering installing a government in the West Bank that they would run.
No, I mean, I think we'll have nothing better than that, but that is
for sure.
Yeah, okay. One of the big problems in the Middle East is literally no one wants to preside over the Palestinians.
Yeah,
no one.
So
the Arab states, Israel, no.
So I think the issue is, and I'm largely actually, I'm very sympathetic towards the Palestinians because I think that for since 48 and onwards, I think that all of the Arabs super gassed them up on that. They wanted Palestinians.
Freda, eso. Lo controlamos.
As on and they realized that the pause, states have started to drop out, so you're getting these bilateral peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. You're getting multilateral agreements like the Abraham Accords, and now the Palestinians are looking around and like, okay, well, you guys told us to fight all this time, and now the only people we have supporting us are the Iranian proxies. So the Palestinians are in a very weird spot where they've like lost all their support. I think that Israel, what I would say to be quote unquote critical of Israel is Israel needs to take strong steps towards peace that probably involves them enduring some undue hardship. So not the October 7th attacks, because Jesus, that's way too much.
but other types of attacks that they might have to deal with that might cause some civilians to die that they don't come out over the top with and retaliate with if there's ever going to be peace in that region. However, another thing that I've always said is a huge problem between Israel and Palestine is I think that both sides think that if they continue to fight, it will be good for them. But the problem is one side is delusional. I think Israel wants to continue to fight because they get justifications for the annexation of the Golan Heights. They get justifications for expansion, especially in Area C, that I think they're probably going to try to annex soon. They get justifications for increased military posturing, towards the embargoes. And Israel is right that if the conflict continues, the situation only improves for Israel over time. But the Palestinians also all believe that if they keep fighting, they've thought this since 2000 under Arafat, that if they just keep fighting, they'll get better gains too. That's not the case.
Is there a difference between Palestinian citizens and the leadership?
I love all people. I love all people around the world, and I think that when we analyze issues, I think that we have to be very honest with what people on the ground think, and the idea that Hamas is just a one-off thing in the Gaza Strip is not only
¿Cuál va a ser el tercer auto de esta? Es lo que me pregunto. ¿Cuál va a ser el tercer auto de esta?
The most recent polling shows, I say 75 to 80% support the October 7th attacks. Palestinians in general want to fight in violent conflict with Israel. That's not just the position of the government. That's not just people. There's a reason why Abbas doesn't want to do elections in the West Bank, and it's because the Palestinian people really do want to fight with Israel. But to combat that problem is like, you have to get the UN on board. We've got to do an actual addressing of the Palestinian refugee problem, which is handled like a joke right now. Iran has to be brought to the table in terms of negotiations. There has to be huge efforts made to economically revitalize these like Palestinian areas. The world. You have to do something about the embargo and the blockade and the Gaza Strip, which isn't just maintained by Israel, it's also maintained by Egypt. That's why, there's a lot of things that have to happen to fix that problem. But the reality is I don't think Israel really wants to, because they get to continue their expansion into the West Bank, and I don't think anybody around the world really cares that much. So we won't be talking about
I will argue with that. The idea that Israel does not want to end the conflict is belied.
Vamos a usar el pulsar GTIR.
So when we talk about settlements, for example, Israel did have settlements inside the Gaza Strip. There were 8,000 Jews who were living inside.
Pero ese no es para road. Puta madre, ese es para off-road.
They withdrew all of those people and took them literally out of their homes. And the result was not the burgeoning of a better attitude toward the state of Israel with regard to, for example, the Palestinian population in Gaza. In fact, it was more radical in Gaza than it was in the West Bank. The result was obviously the election of Hamas, the acts in which, unfortunately, many civilians took part in the October 7th attack. There's video of people rushing, or civilians, and dressed in civilian clothing, into Israeli villages.
It's always the same thing.
Well, no, that is it. That is
Lo siento, se ve.
when it comes to
Justo me tocó
Israel's
lloviendo en estos días.
Biden desired for territorial expansion, Area C. So for those who are not familiar with the Oslo Accords, and again, this is getting very difficult, but the Oslo Accords are broken down into 3 areas of the West Bank. Area A is under full Palestinian. Area B, which is mixed Israeli-Palestinian control, where Israel provides some level of military security.
No, puta!
And then there's Area C. And Area C was like 2
Hijo de la verga.
authority if the Oslo Accords had moved forward. Those are disputed territories. There is building taking place in Area C by both actually, talks about Palestinians as well as Israelis. And the question is whether if Israel stopped building, there have been many settlement agreements in the past, including some undertaken by and it actually has not done one iota good all forward in terms of actual negotiations. And the biggest problem is that the leadership for Palestinians has spent every day since really 67. It's not even 48. That's after 48 and 67. Jordan was in charge of the West Bank. Egypt was in charge of the Gaza Strip. And at no point did either of those powers say, hey, maybe we ought to hand this over to an independent Palestinian state, which was originally the division that was promoted by the UN Partition Plan of 47. Because of that, the leadership post-67, really starting in 64, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 64, and it called for the liberation of the land. In 64, they had the West Bank and they had the Gaza Strip, so they're talking about Tel Aviv. When it was founded in 64,
Mira otra vez por acá. Hemos pasado por aquí con Midcar.
Every Palestinian leader in Arabic to people that they are talking to. Yasser Arafat famously speaking English,
Esa última curva está satánica. Esa última curva está en ojete, güey. Eso, vámonos. Pum, logrado.
You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind. Israelis do not want that. In fact, Israelis didn't want that so much that they allowed rockets to fall in their cities for full-on 18 years in order to avoid sending soldiers en masse back into the Gaza Strip.
Israel does want to continue to expand settlements in the West Bank, right? They want to continue to build. They want to build East Jerusalem.
Well, I mean, East Jerusalem has already been annexed. So East Jerusalem is, according to Israel,
Otro de esos.
Okay, so there's that. With regard to, does Israel have an interest in expanding settlements in the West Bank? Why would they not until there's a peace partner?
Sure, that's what I mean, but I'm saying as long as the conflict...
You have arrived early.
No, your suggestion is that they're incentivizing the conflict to continue so they
Tengo
can
demasiados
grab the
autos
land.
repetidos
I don't
además.
think there's like a plan, like so some people say,
Mira, el
for
Linko
instance,
3 también yo lo tengo. Tengo la Nissan. También tengo la de Berti, güey.
People in the Gaza Strip by allowing Qatari money to come in, even though he was actually speaking in opposition to Abbas, allowing the Gaza Strip to fall for Netanyahu to clear it out for him, they give it back, etc., etc. I'm not claiming those theories. I'm just saying that I think that Israel would take a relatively neutral stance towards conflict enduring, because as long as the conflict endures and as long as the settlements can expand, I think that ultimately benefits Israel.
Let's put it this way. If suddenly there arose among the Palestinians a deep and abiding desire for peace, approved by a vast majority of the population with serious security guarantees, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find Israelis who would not be willing to at least consider that.
Quedó muy bien esta hoja,
I would agree with you on October 6th. I think we're probably a year or two away from that right now.
But the point I'm making is that Israelis now realize that the entire peace process was a sham. People who were on the other side of the table were using it as a Trojan horse in the first place. The death of Oslo is not the death of Israeli hopefulness. It's the death of the illusion that the other side of the table was anyone who bargained. That's what's happening, and that's why you have this sort of insane disconnect right now between the United States and the Israeli government. Again, it's unity. No one in Israel is talking about making concessions to the Palestinian Authority for a wide variety of reasons, including the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is not an actual terrorist and
which is from the moderate West Bank.
Right, exactly. So, again,
Sí salta, el pulsita.
in Israel for this is or the Chiloni, right? Those are the most secular people in Israel. What about the place that was attacked? What people should understand is that October 7th was not an attack against settlements in the West Bank. It was an attack on peace villages that were essentially disarmed. And many of these people who were killed were peace activists who were literally trying to work with people in Gaza. I mean, it's mind-boggling. That's why you've had this ground shift in Israel. The next 20 years in Israel is going to be about security and economic development. Period. End of story. Everything else goes second.
And I will say, I agree essentially with what you're saying. Not to loop back to another topic, one of the reasons then why I was so critical, I don't want to say critical, but like kind of nonchalant about the Abraham Accord, because they didn't address anything with the Palestinians whatsoever. They weren't super relevant to the conflict. They didn't bring in Qatar.
¿Cooperativo o solo? Me la pasé bien solo, fíjate. Cooperativo está chido porque son menos, pero luego te toca gente deja.
I think that Biden has done better than I certainly expected him to do in terms of support for Israel. Like Obama was way less supportive of Israel versus Biden by every metric. With that said, the rhetoric that he's been using recently and the Blinken have been using recently about Israel needs to make painful concessions for peace. Israel recentering this issue at the center of relations in the Middle East is doomed to failure. The magic is a strong word.
Voy a usar este M3, M5, mejor dicho.
Was proof of what you're saying, which is true, which is that all the surrounding countries, in reality, have abandoned the idea that there's a centrality to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That is not the central conflict in the Middle East. And by the way, one of the reasons it's not the central conflict in the Middle East is because, actually, ironically, because of the rise of Iran. Right? It's Sunni states that are largely signing up with Israel because they're realizing they need some sort of counterweight to a burgeoning
Vamos a darle. Vamos a darle.
My main problem with my policy with regard to Ukraine is that he outsourced the end goal of the war to Zelensky early on. Now, that might make sense if that goal were something that he was willing to fund to the point of achievement, or if Zelensky could have achieved it on his own. Right now, and
Vamos, güey, métele.
Pretty early on in the war, it was very clear that, for example, Crimea was one nowhere. The Russians had controlled Crimea, barring the United States, mission by S-16s over Crimea. Nothing was going to change over that. The same thing was true in most of the Donbass, right? That was not going to change. Zelensky's stated goal, and you understand it, he's a leader of Ukraine, right? Is that there was a grenation on his territory in 2014. And that the Russians sent their little green men across the border and then they took all of these areas. So he, as the leader of Ukraine, is saying, okay, I want all of that back. Now, the reality is that the U.S.'s interests had largely been achieved in the first few months of the war, meaning the revocation of the ability of Russia to take Ukraine and just ingest it, and two, the devastation of Russia's military capability. I mean, Russia has just been wrecked. I mean, the military is in serious straits because of the war in Ukraine. From an American perspective, I'm very much pro all of that. I think that we have an interest in Ukraine maintaining the buffer status against
Nos orientamos fácilmente.
Russia. I think that the United States does have an interest in degrading the Russian military to the extent they can threaten the Baltic states or threaten
Además, este M5 va bien.
The problem I have with Biden's strategy is, as always, I think that it's muddle, and I think muddles tend to end with misperceptions. War tends to break out and maintain because of misperception. Misperception the other side's strength, and all of the rest. People misperceive what's going to happen. Say, I'll cross that line and nothing will happen. I'll cross that line, they'll greet me as the liberator, and because the United States just surrendered in Afghanistan, essentially, they won't do anything, and the West is fragmenting, NATO's fragmenting, and all the rest of this, and obviously he was wrong on all of those scores. The problem for Biden is that, as with virtually every war, no end in mind was set. And so it became out recently, it was widely reported that actually there was a peace deal that was on the table in the first 2 months that Putin was on board with, that basically would have ceded Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea to Russia in return for solidification of those lines, American and Western security guarantees to Ukraine. Right? Ukraine would formally join NATO, but there would be security guarantees to Ukraine. We're ending up there anyway. It's just taking a lot more money and a lot more time to get there.
And do you think Trump would have helped push that peace?
Yes, and I think that Biden actually did Zelensky a bit of a disservice because Zelensky knows where this war is going to end. It's not going to end with Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea in Ukraine. It's just not going to, and he knows that. What actually, in my opinion, Zelensky was for Joe Biden to be the person who forced that deal on so that he could then go back
Grande el M5, güey.
and
Una
say,
chulada.
listen guys, I wanted all those things, but the Americans weren't willing to allow me to have all those things. And so we did
Creo que estás
an amazing
toque
job,
este.
a heroic job defending our land. We devastated the Russian military, even though no one expected us to, but we can't get back those things because it's unrealistic to get back those things because America basically, they're a big funder and they're the ones who want the deal. Instead, what Biden said, and this was reported in the Washington Post last year, the Biden administration said, we're going to fight for as long as it takes with as much as it takes, and when they were asked until when, they said whatever Zelensky says.
Vamos para allá.
And that's not a policy. That's just a recipe for a frozen conflict with endless funding. Now, it may be that Putin has walked away from the table and that deal is no longer available. If that deal is available right now, I certainly hope that's being pursued behind closed doors. My main critique, again, of Biden is that when you outsource the end goal to another country without stating what America's interest is, I also think that Biden did really quite a poor job of sort of explaining what America's realistic interests are. I don't like it when American leaders, it's weird for me to say this, I'm not a huge fan of the we're in it to protect democracy kind of rhetoric, because frankly we are allied with many, many countries that are not democracies, and that's not actually how foreign policy works. We should, as an overall, 30,000-foot goal, advance democracy and rights where we can. The reason that we were fighting in favor of Ukraine, and when I say fighting, the reason we were doing that in favor of Ukraine is not because of Ukraine's long history of clean voting and non-corruption. The reason that we were doing that is to counter Russian interests in the region, and it was pure realpolitik play. And that realpolitik play is hard to deny no matter what side of the aisle you're on. I think that what many Americans are reverting to is we have no interest there. Why are we spending money there and not spending money here, and that kind of stuff. And that argument can always be applied unless we actually articulate the reason why it's good for Americans beyond simply the ideological for the United States to be involved in a thing. So, for example, I think right now, when Biden is talking, I think that what Biden just did is the United States is striking the Houthis. I think that that's a really, really good thing. I think that's a necessary thing. I think American people should understand why that is happening. It's not because of quote-unquote ideology. It is, on a very level, but really it's because you're screwing up the straits. You can't do that. You can't screw up free trade. And Americans have an interest in not seeing all of our prices at the grocery store double and triple because a bunch of ragtag pirates, the Barbary pirates from 1800, are bothering everyone.
But Ben said a lot there. Do you disagree with any aspect on the Ukraine side?
A little bit, yeah. I think on the macro I agree, maybe we get into these a little bit. On the final thing that he said, though, I wish
that Americans could have honest conversations about foreign policy. I think that it would just be better for everybody. I don't know if it's Red Scare after the Cold War, where it was like literally, the behemoths fighting against communism, and we felt like after 91, every single foreign policy decision needs to be able to be explained in like 7 words, like he's the bad guy, and that's it. I wish we had more honest conversations about what our foreign policy interest is.
Mercedes, bro.
I don't think most Americans honestly could even articulate why Israel or why it's important to defend Ukraine against Russia, or why should we care about Taiwan at all. I don't know if most Americans could articulate anything there, even though they might have very strong opinions about why we ought to be involved in certain conflicts. So I do agree with that. I wish we had more honest conversations about foreign policy. In terms of how Biden has handled Ukraine, the things that I liked the most were, one, that he was very clear in the beginning about what we wouldn't do. So Biden saying that we're not going to do, not a red line, no-fly zones over Ukraine. We're not going to be deploying troops on the ground in Ukraine. We're not going to be doing anything that would have, U.S. soldiers and Russian soldiers crossing swords. It's not going to happen. I like that he made that very clear at the beginning. And I like that he coalition built between NATO and the EU to get people to send funds, training, soldiers, airplanes, and everything to Ukraine. I thought those 2 things were really good. In terms of basically writing Zelensky a blank check, I would like to hope that Biden and the entire United States learned a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, that open-ended missions...
Muy bonito auto. Me gusta más la conducción del M5. Pero pues también el M5 es un auto más grande. Es del 2003, el que ocupamos. Bueno, AMG Coupé. El Hammer Coupé. Muy bonito, muy bonito. Y esos rines te cagas lo bonitos que están.
At some point there's going to be an off-ramp here, and I think even a month or 2 ago, I think that discussion had begun with Zelensky looking for an off-ramp. But publicly, of course, the United States is never going to come out and say, we're going to support you guys to fight as much as you want for 3 months. And then after that, it's no more. Obviously, that can't be the statement. It's always going to be that we're going to support you in your fight against Russia.
Yeah, we tried that under Obama with Afghanistan. It was terrible.
Sure. Yeah, you can't.
We'll escalate the troop levels to only for 6 months, and then we'll.
Yeah, you just can't do that. It's always going to come off as we're going to support you forever, and as long as it takes, and as long as you need whatever we have to do to defend freedom and democracy in your country. And any other statement would be absurd. So I can understand why it feels like on a public level a blank check and an indefinite time period was granted to Zelensky, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think, I hope
pues mira, vamos a ocupar un RS6. Fíjate, el M5 ya lo ocupamos, vamos a ocupar su competidor directo que es el RS6 de Audi. De esa época, 2003.
It's obvious that they're not going to capture the Donbass. It's obvious that they're not going to capture Crimea. I agree for Crimea, that was incredibly obvious. But it was also really obvious that in 2 weeks, Russia would own Kiev and Ukraine was going to be Belarus.
El del transportador.
Even for a lot of people, and analysts around the world, that was an expectation, or at least a significant probability. Nobody knew
Este RS6 no se ve tan agresivo como el M5, pero también
so I can understand why, especially if you're Ukraine and if you're repelled an invasion from one of the world's largest armies, like you might feel like, well, fuck it, let's fight for a few months, let's fight for a year, let's see what happens. And I can understand the United States supporting them, but I agree that there has to be some reasonable off-ramp, but we're not going to fight forever. I think the U.S. has already begun those conversations with Zelensky to look at what that off-ramp looks like. But yeah, I'm not too sure, other than like explicitly stating publicly, like, you can only fight until this date.
Cabrón, se rebasa. Yo iba a decir justamente que la conducción es lo mejor de este auto. La potencia tal vez no tanto, pero ahí se rebasa.
There's like $105 billion deal that's been held up by debate between Republicans and Democrats over border. So basically, it contains $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, another several $billion for Taiwanese defense against China, and then it includes some border funding and some border provisions. Republicans want border funding and the border provisions because we can get into the illegal immigration issue, but that's a pretty serious issue. And Biden and Democrats have been unwilling to hold that up, and that seems to me like, just from put aside Republicans and Democrats, it seems like political malpractice. Meaning there's a widespread perception in the United States that the border is a disaster area. Joe Biden wants these things. Many Republicans don't want these things. He's on the border stuff. He gets all the things that he wants, and he's going to be able to go back to moderates in the country and say, I did something about the border. It seems like such an obvious win. And
if he takes up the border starting on the Ukraine stuff?
Yes, because then he gets the whole package. I mean, he can go back to his own base and he can say, listen, guys, I wanted to be easy on the border. The Republicans forced me to it, but we needed the Ukraine aid. We needed the Taiwan aid.
Yeah. You're going to be more educated than me on this. I don't like, or maybe I just don't know enough.
I don't like the principle that when we negotiate things in the United States, there's like 50 million hostages at all points in time for every single thing. Like, oh boy, here comes the debt ceiling. What do the Republicans want? What do the Democrats want? Oh boy, like here, we can't fund our government. But I mean, obviously, the argument is going to be that if the Ukraine funding doesn't come in this bill, and if Biden and his administration feel like it's really important, that not unilaterally, but as a single issue, it's not going to pass. So I would say that at this point, and I don't know what the conversations look like between the Biden administration and Zelensky, I would say at this point that it's probably fair to start making contingencies on the money that we give to Ukraine. That listen, like this conflict has waged on now. Like now we need to start looking for potential peace. So, I mean, if those strings are attached, I'd be okay with it. But the broader question of, like, is it okay?
El interior del Audi está chido. No tanto como el del M5, fíjate. Ni como el del Mech. Pero pues está bien.
One of the big issues in this presidential election is going to be January 6th. It's in the news now, and I think it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So, question for Destiny first. Did Donald Trump incite insurrection on January 6, 2021?
Absolutely. This is probably ignoring every other issue we've talked about, which I think there are plenty that I would say disqualify Trump from playing on this. I think that the conduct and the behavior leading up to and including January 6th, I think is wildly indefensible. I am excited to see them trying to, the 3 to 4 stages are the taking what I think any reasonable person would say knowingly false information about elections being rigged or ballot boxes being stuffed or Ruby Freeman, running ballots 3 times in Georgia, taking that knowingly false information and trying to call state secretaries and stuff to have them flip their electoral vote. That was horrible. The plot that Eastman hatched in order to have these like false slates of electors where all 7 states had citizens go in and falsely say that they were the duly elected electors that could submit votes to Congress. That was insane. That happened. Asking or begging Pence to accept these false states of electors initially and then just say you should just throw it out to the House delegation.
¿Qué hora llegas, maestro?
Majority Republican.
Otro que llega demasiado tarde. No, y pues le tiré cosas. No, mico, para mañana.
Don't you think maybe you guys should delay the vote a little bit? Don't you think they're just really mad about the election? And he said to McCarthy, they're more upset than you.
Otra vez el 2021 Lincoln Company. Fan of dice,
stop the rioting that happened on January 6th because he was too busy taking advantage of it. I think all of these things are horrible. I look forward to seeing the Jack Smith indictments play out in court. Maybe even the Georgia Rico case. But I think all of these things are
unfathomable.
Lincoln Company. From start to finish, clearly the goal the entire time was to circumvent the peaceful transfer of power.
Vamos a hacer esta madre.
Start to finish. Whether it was through false claims,
700 pickups y 4x4.
or whether it was through violence at the Capitol.
Son las 8, ayer ni streamaste, hiciste. Ni streamaste segundo, nada.
So, there are 2 elements to incitement and insurrection. One is incitement, the other is insurrection. So,
es que ayer igual salí.
So does insurrection. Neither of the standards are met. So, if you're asking me, morally speaking, did Donald Trump do the right thing between November 4th and January 6th? I said, I will continue to say no, he did not. I think he was saying things that are false, with just factually false about his theories with regard to the election, about the election being stolen, about fraud, located in court, many of the claims being brought publicly and all the rest of it. If we're talking about incitement and insurrection,
Valió
it has to be immediate. All this action.
¿Sí se metió el pinche batuco o abandonó?
Did I incite them? The media tends to use the word incitement very loosely with regard to this sort of stuff, in the same way that Bernie Sanders would
No te quedas papada, maestro.
He did not.
¿Ya viste que entrevistaron a Vladimir Putin? Estuvo interesante entrevista.
Insurrection, typically in insurrection, there are some descriptions in case law, though none in statutory law, as far as I know. The typical description in case law is the replacement of one legitimate government of the United States with another by violent means. The notion that Donald Trump coordinated any such insurrection is belied by the FBI itself. The FBI put out a report in August of 2021, suggesting that there was no well-coordinated insurrectionist attempt coordinated by the White House. In fact, what you had was Donald Trump.
A ver, así se unió el Chihuatuc. A perro, tiene un helicóptero, güey. Su madre, güey. Hijo de su madre. Madre de su hijo. Foto final. Cross country. Ah, ¿eso es un F-150? Lightning? Ah, está bien perra.
There are insurrection statutes that do exist. No one was charged under those particular statutes. There were some people who you could say informally had insurrectionist ideas. Those people who want to hang Nancy Pelosi or kill Mike Pence. And those people are in jail right now. And the election went forward. The election was certified. Mike Pence presided over the certification. Mitch McConnell presided over the certification. Joe Biden has been the president for the last 3 years. So Donald Trump, by the way, was still president at that point. If he had actually wanted to do what other people would actually want to do.
Vamos, está bien chida esa troca, güey.
The word that's carrying a lot of weight there is so knowingly implies evil. So I think the information was disseminated as well. But I think that Donald Trump has the capacity to convince himself of nearly anything that is benefit us. That's actually what Donald Trump. The evidence of that is Donald Trump. So the idea that I'm more power. I'm not even sure it's there. I'm more power, baby.
Ya voy.
So I don't actually. So I'm glad that you're turning that. We are assessing Australia when we're looking at certain persons. It's a reasonable person. Would a reasonable person have known that they were? No, it depends on the mens rea standards. It's not something you have to establish individual.
Mira, mira.
Surely when you're talking about reasonable person statutes, a reasonable person statute is should be reasonable. That's what reasonable person statute is. So for establish actual order first. But for first degree murder, you don't state I plan to kill this person. I intend to kill this person. And prove that statement. You need about substantial evidence. Correct. Yeah, sure. So I feel like my feeling for Donald Trump was there were all these people around him that he trusted to investigate the election. He trusted Barr and the DOJ. He asked Pence.
Eso,
He looked into it. He asked staff. He asked his legal counsel. So many people, ostensibly, he trusted them. He asked them. All of them looked into it and reported back to him.
Yes, cabrón.
Unless we're going to literally make the concession that Trump actually.
Real dragón.
I'm saying that, like, at that point, you should not have known that he was going and propagating claims that he asked all of the people he trusted to those claims to Michigan and to Georgia, publicly, and to try to convince people to throw out the election.
Logrado.
You're doing the same thing. You're reverting to
Hoy que jugamos, hoy tú vas a jugar con mi pichula.
Yes, a reasonable person should have known. Donald Trump now? That's a different question. And so conflating those two questions is going to get you into this message here. By the way, this is why Jack Smith charged the way Jack Smith charged. Yeah, which was why Jack Smith did not charge conspiracy. Jack Smith
Juega con la pichula. La primera la ganamos, vamos por la segunda. Culo.
Broadly, I would say, pretty obviously expanding statutory coverage in weird areas in order to cover a thing that doesn't quite fit into any of these legal categories. But the point that I'm making is that Jack Smith is on my side of this. He doesn't think that he can actually establish the intent necessary to convict under a seditious conspiracy or an insurrection.
I agree with that, but I think a lot of the underlying facts, though, because he does bring up those calls to Raffensperger and Georgia, he does bring up the indictments that they were knowingly false information. So it seems like that's going to be part of the case, maybe not to convict on any of the four particular charges that you mentioned, but it seems like that's probably going to be part of what he's going to have to establish in court to convict Trump.
So I want to look at the actual text of the charges. So I'm sorry that I don't have them memorized, but I believe one's a fraud charge that generally does not apply to cases like this. Generally, the fraud charge is like you're trying to steal money from the government.
Sure, private's been used pretty broadly in the
vamos
past,
allá.
though it doesn't have to be, because Smith has done oral arguments in response to a lot of the claims by Trump lawyers. This was one of them. The infinite civil and criminal immunity was another one of them, where he cites past cases where these types of things, because I think it was to defraud of civil rights, I think was the fourth charge.
Right, so the defraud of civil rights is usually somebody standing in the
Mames,
actual like,
pinche
voting house
vato,
door and
güey.
preventing you from voting.
6 estrellas,
Not, you have a
nivel
species legal theory that
236.
you're
Ya está
espousing
cerca de llegar a
about
las 7
whether those
estrellas el
votes
pinche
should
vato.
be thrown out.
Sure.
Yeah,
Although I don't like when we say species legal theory and novel application, which I do agree some of these, in some ways, is novel.
Pues
I don't think
enfermo,
we've
pa.
ever also had a president. It is a novel situation where somebody has resisted the peaceful transfer of power in this country.
Well, it'll be. I feel like the legal cases. I mean, that's not true. But Gore sued in 2000. I mean, so like if we're talking about the
This
legal
was comparable
cases,
to Gore. If this was comparable to Gore.
I'm not saying it's comparable to Gore. I'm saying that if the idea is that espousing a legal theory in court amounts to de facto some form of election denial or interference in some way, that can't. That's not, as a general principle, it's over-inclusive.
Sure. Gore wasn't trying to decent. They challenged their thing to the Supreme Court. They lost it to the Supreme Court, and then power transferred.
Right, and Donald Trump had a bunch of legal challenges, and then he had a rally, and then there was a riot, and then he left after.
Yeah, but the Eastman theory of what Pence could do in Congress is a far cry
A
away.
truly shitty theory. I mean, make no mistake.
But not
really
just shitty. I think that if any Democrat had done this, I feel like we'd be looking at it in a far different. As in, we would be using terms like attempted coup, subversion of peaceful transfer of power. If a Democrat vice president had tried to essentially say that in Congress they could throw away the vote.
So, I think what I want to get to here, actually, so we can be more specific,
Sure.
is why are these terms important? We
Eso-
agree on, largely speaking, what happened. I think the characterization of the term, we keep coming back to different categories. I want to make sure we check. Are we? Okay, so we're
not looking at incitement. Fine. But nobody's charging with incitement, and I don't believe insurrection is part of that. So we've done it legal. Just in terms of like a president that is trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Bloodless coup or a coup or whatever contemporaneous.
Right, so prevent the peaceful transfer of power with all means or using means that are inappropriate.
Using means that are inappropriate or
Okay. Inappropriate. Okay, so illegal. I don't think so. I don't think that these charges actually meet the criteria for the various charges. We can discuss each case if you want.
Sure.
As far as inappropriate, sure. I think tons of inappropriate stuff. I mean, inappropriate.
The reason I don't like the word inappropriate though is because then conservatives are very quick to say, well, sure, he was inappropriate, but everybody was inappropriate.
I mean, I'll concede that he's more inappropriate than others. I just don't see that
Most
as
inappropriate.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean,
that's
like-
important to me though. Does it not bother you that like Donald Trump sought through legal and extra legal and Trump magical ways of trying to entrench his power as president past when he should have been able to? Is that not something that was incredibly troublesome?
I mean, the question to me is the bigger question that I think the Democrats are trying to promote this election cycle, which is this means he is a threat to democracy sufficient that if he were to win the election, there would not be another.
Is that
He is
not?
such
But
a-
he
and my
tried
answer
to do
to
that
that
last
is-
time. Could he not try to do that last time?
I mean, he could try to do whatever he wants, presumably, and he would fail the same way that he did last time.
Why do we think
Vamos.
Because he failed.
so?
Because there was a
once
riot
and
every
never
3 hours. Yes.
Like, let's say hypothetically, Giuliani was the next.
¡Ah, la verga! ¿Qué pasó ahí?
Giuliani was
Güey, no mames, what the fuck?
well,
Güey, ¿qué pasó ahí?
because so much
¿Qué
of
pasó
the
ahí?
party just might
¿Qué pasó ahí? No mames, no, güey, no, güey, no.
I don't know the answer to that.
Sure.
Puto pinche fan.
But I mean, like,
Dice,
say if not
¿qué estás
Giuliani,
viendo?
say
¿Está
if there
en
were any
inglés?
other
Sí,
number of
estoy viendo un,
people that Trump
estoy viendo un debate.
theoretically
Batuk.
put on his side of the government,
¿Cuáles son los mejores cariños?
next time, because there were a
No,
lot of people
¿viste
that
eso?
were
¿Cómo saltó al final?
all in the United States.
Güey, pinche salto ilegal, cabrón. Qué mamada. Ese salto, güey.
And I feel like last time going in,
No
there's a
mames.
little bit of mind reading a macro. Maybe
No
I think that Trump kind of thought, one, I don't think Trump knows
¿Viste eso,
much at all
cabrón?
about how the government works. I think we probably do that. I think Trump probably thought that if he had people that were like at least in his party and kind of camp, that they'll basically do whatever needs to be done to give him what he wants, and with no respect for process. But now that he sees that, well, it's not enough to just have allies. I need people that are fiercely elite,
would we not be worried that a guy that tried to essentially steal the election for real wouldn't try to pick people that would be more amenable to his...
I believe in the checks and balances of American government. I believe they worked under it.
güey,
So if you're asking me, do I think that Trump has
yo lo
bad
quise
intent
chocar
or
y
could have bad
se
intent,
frenó,
that
güey,
sort of
chocó
stuff?
una cosa.
Sure. Do I believe that the guardrails
No, yo en esa puta
continue
última
to hold?
curva,
Also,
güey.
sure.
No sé qué pasó ahí, que saltó el culo del coche y pues...
And they blatantly said, like, they said, like, I want to be an authoritarian, I'm going to abolish all elections. You would say, sure, he's saying that, but, like, I don't think he can actually do it, so it's okay if he runs for president, you don't care at all as long as you feel like the guardrails...
I mean, I might prefer other candidates, but I think that also one of the things that you do is that politicians, again, this would be an exceptional circumstance, but politicians constantly make promises about the things that they are going to do and then don't fulfill, and we tend to take those out in the wash, meaning that, you know, if I promise that day one, as Donald Trump has pledged to do, that he's going to deport literally every illegal immigrant into the country, do I think he's actually going to do that? I mean, I really highly doubt it. He didn't do it last time he was in office. That's just, there are many examples of this.
I agree.
Do I think, here's my question, do you think the guardrails are going to fail to hold?
I'm not sure.
Really?
Yeah, because I think the issue is one, when it's election time, Republicans are spineless in office, and I don't know how many congressmen would support what he wants just because they want to win re-election or because they think it's inevitable anyway.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that happened in 2022 is Democrats ran directly on this platform. A bunch of Republicans lost. Were running on this platform. Literally every Secretary of State ran on the Donald Trump, we should deny elections platform. Lost in every state.
Sure, but other Republicans that have been...
Sure,
but I mean, like, look at what happened with, like, Kinzinger and
Cheney,
right, who were very, like, staunchly anti-Trump after J6 for that select committee, right? Kinzinger didn't even run again, and Cheney lost her election by, I think, the widest margin that anybody has ever lost.
It may not be a tiger,
like,
but a big cat, that's for sure. Seen it sideways
it's
3
a
times,
position to me
and
for
the Cheshire
like,
will
principled stances of government.
secure.
The idea that a man who has... And I think we...
Ok, es como un jaguar ese
Donald
reto.
Trump's...
Es como un jaguar.
Donald Trump's only allegiance is to Donald Trump, right? We agree on that. The
¿Qué
only thing he
jaguar
cares
es? ¿Sabes
about
qué
is Donald
jaguar
Trump.
es?
It's the only thing he cares about. I think it's certainly the largest thing he
It's
cares
the largest thing he cares
Jaguar.
about, right? So you've got a man who only cares about himself.
Welcome to politics. I mean, it may be more...
But that's not even...
It may be more with Trump, but it's certainly not unique to Trump.
I think that the
This
issue
is
with
the
Trump,
F-type,
though,
no?
is... I think he's even a threat to the Republican Party, which I think he would mostly agree with me. Maybe not overall, but on every individual point. Trump picks bad candidates. He has no concern for the future of the Republican Party. Like, for instance, I think there is a chance...
Hay que ponerlo a driftear a tu...
Now,
¿Sabes
if Trump didn't
driftear?
get the nomination, I think Trump would say, screw
You
it.
know the drifting or not?
Possibly,
yeah,
you
could
know,
be.
again, Trump he was really content to throw Georgia,
cabrón.
the 2 runoff elections under the bus because Raffensperger didn't support him for the election.
So, what is all this surface stuff? What's the generalized argument that you're making? Do you believe? I'll go back to my question. Do you think that if Trump wins, there will be no more elections? Is that like what
I don't
percentage on it? What percentage do you think that that's a reality? That
If Donald Trump wins, I think there is a 100% chance that he will try to win.
And then that's what
I can guarantee you he will not do that. Because in the second term, he's no longer eligible, and he will believe he won.
Yeah,
So
because
this the
Donald Trump
number.
himself having the third term.
What is Donald Trump on third debate?
Hold on.
If you want to prevent him from creating a revolution, you probably should just appoint the president and
Here's
be run against.
another broad argument that I don't like in favor of Trump, and this was brought up earlier in terms of like we talk about like not grading presidents on a curve, but then earlier we said we take Biden's rhetoric.
Oh no, I totally grade Trump. I 100% grade presidents. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I grade pretty much everybody on a curve.
Then I feel like
I don't treat my 7-year-old the same way
like-
that I treat my 9-year-old.
Sure, but
And
I don't
Trump
like
treats
that.
Obama.
It feels like we're treating Donald Trump like a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old. I think we should treat him like the president.
Ah, está en la
I don't think
zona
having a
verde,
president
okay.
that has taken like concrete steps to prevent the transfer of power, which he did with the electorate sham, which he did with Pence, and which he did with trying to capitalize on the J6 violence. A president that's taken concrete steps towards coupping the government, essentially. I don't know why that guy we'd say, well, you know, it's Trump, it is Trump things. The guardrails help, probably hold back. So let me say we should.
I
Do
just
you mean that he should be actually barred from office?
I'm just talking about support for him. I don't think Republicans should. Advantage. The guy's obviously self-destructive. He's destructive to political party.
La verga, ¿por qué tu humo es negro, güey? ¿Qué chingas mío
I think
también?
there's a case to be made, but man, the phrasing, as much as our governmental founding fathers and everybody else, wrote nice and constitution, some of the phrasing was very, very, very blah. And the Section 3, requiring any type of actual conviction, I don't have a strong feeling on it. I will say I'm very interested in reading
¿Por qué no se ve más oscuro aquí que en la otra vez?
uphold and
states should be able to decide if they leave them off the ballot or not. I think for the political future,
A perros, ¿ya lo tienes con white body?
that the leading opposition candidate, if laws move out, is probably not healthy for us.
We're talking about threats to democracy. That would be applied
It
across
would,
the board, by the way.
it would be, however, like that threat to democracy was earned by Donald Trump. I think conservatives made a dangerous gamble when they
Bueno, sé
took
que tenía
office,
white
and
body
now like all of the
sí,
fallout
sí.
from that is something we all has to
I mean, I think that the unprecedented legal theory that a state can simply bar somebody from the ballot on the basis of, in an informal way, believing that he is quote-unquote an insurrectionist is pretty wild. I mean, that's
pretty well, but there is an amendment in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that says that if they have engaged in this, they shall not be, or you shall, I don't remember the phrase, self-executing arguably thing.
If we're getting into constitutional law, I mean, there are a number of provisions that suggest that it's, number one, not self-executing. I mean, minority opinions in the Colorado Supreme Court case are pretty fair. The number one contention, which is that this is not self-executing because other elements are not self-executing, that ignores subsequent actual law that happened. I mean, the Congress passed a law, for example, in 1872 defining who was an insurrectionist, who was not an insurrectionist for purposes of elections. In 1994, Congress passed a law that specifically defined insurrections as criminal activities, and that somebody could theoretically be convicted of insurrection and therefore ineligible to run for office. It is unlike, say, the
festival.
analogs that are used by majority opinion, like age. Obviously, this is not the same thing.
Ya tengo el
We can all
MG
tell
de
what
carreras.
somebody's age is by looking at the birth certificate. I can't tell whether somebody's an insurrectionist without any reference to a legal statute or definition of the term.
I would also be careful with that because
MG,
remember, one of Trump's
MG,
first
a ver qué tal
legal
está.
actions was challenging Obama's birth certificate.
Well, and I thought that was dumb at the time.
Pues 800.
I like that you both said
Me.
100%
Yo esperaba más. La verdad.
Hands up high. I'm a two-term president. I'm the only president since Grover Cleveland, since Grover Cleveland, who served 2 non-consecutive terms. I kicked Joe Biden out of office, and I kicked Hillary Clinton out of office. Dude would be like, he'd be living large. You're kidding? He doesn't want the presidency anymore after that.
I just think that I think it's scary that like Donald Trump, it feels like for all of the accusations that are made sometimes against Democrats, Biden is ordering Garland to investigate Donald Trump and blah blah blah. It seems like Donald Trump would actually do that with his DOJ, would give them orders.
He didn't. He didn't.
Well,
he
kind of did though, right? So, for instance, with Jeffrey Clark went to Rosen and Donahue and said, hey, listen, I need you guys to sign off on a letter that we're going to use essentially to bully states into overturning their elections by saying we found significant election fraud. And part of that threat was Jeffrey Clark saying, listen, if you're not going to do it, Rosen, Trump's going to fire you and just make me the acting attorney general. That was the threat that he carried, and I think Trump repeated that threat in a meeting later on that was, I only rebuked when I think like half the White House staff said, if you do this, we're resigning.
Okay, so that's a slightly different topic because now you're getting into all the election shenanigans and all this, but...
Trump he threatened to fire his acting attorney general if he wouldn't carry the same platform, essentially. Like, if Trump could order his DOJ to do something. It's not beyond the pale for them.
It's not beyond the pale for them to order them to do it, and then it's not beyond the pale for them to reject him doing that, which is the story of his entire administration. Whereas Joe Biden orders his DOJ to do things, and then they just do them.
Well, there. This
is one of the big problems that I have with, I mean, for example, all the talk about Trump tyrant, Trump executive power. I mean, Joe Biden has used executive power in ways that far outstrip
every president has been stretching executive power.
Joe Biden is going.
Hace 800.
Joe Biden has gone well beyond anything Trump
Vamos hasta acá.
even remotely attempted to maintain.
A800 Lincoln Company. A800 Lincoln Company. A800 Lincoln Company. Tengo alguno que sea 800 de esa marca.
I mean, Joe Biden literally used the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration to try to cram down vax mandates on 80 million Americans. That's insane.
Sure,
he literally said, I cannot relieve student loan debt, and then tried to relieve hundreds of billions of dollars. In
but what happens to that?
Got struck down by the Supreme Court. And then they still did it. Biden brags about it.
For what he was able to relieve, which I think were related to particular types of student loan debt. But I'm just saying that the guardrails are holding with Biden as much as they're holding with Trump. The only difference is that once Biden exhausts his executive power, he's not running around lying to people or trying to extort people or trying to concoct insane schemes.
Well, I mean, so here's the way I would think of this. Think of the guardrails holding as the filter, okay? Meaning the coffee is in the filter, some of it's, what you want is going to get through and all the stuff. The guardrails prevent the other stuff from getting through. Now the question becomes, what liquid are you pouring into the filter?
Meaning, so if a filter exists, if the guardrails hold, and if Donald Trump can't steal elections, what's the policy that comes through the other end of the filter? The policy I get from Donald Trump on the other end of the filter is a bunch of stuff that I like. The policy that I get from Joe Biden on the other end of the filter is a bunch of bullshit I don't. So that's the basic calculation.
Okay, so then the idea is essentially that Donald Trump's rhetoric is insane, but we don't care. Donald Trump would probably try to steal an election if he could, but he probably won't be able to.
Pendejo es un speedson, güey. Yo pensé que era un pinche drift.
Güey. Because he won't be eligible to be on the ballot in... by the way, you want to talk about 14th Amendment? Mm-hmm. That's where the 14th Amendment applies. Okay, that's where it actually applies. Meaning he is not qualified to be on the ballot in 2028 if he is the President of the United States. States can literally, in self-executing fashion, take him off the ballot. Just like he's past the age of 35. Once you have been president 2 times, you're no longer eligible to be President of the United States. Then you have a strong little case to keep him off the ballot.
Why would the 14th Amendment stop if he thought Vice President Pence could unilaterally decide the outcome of the election?
When he's not on the ballot? So now your theory is that he's going to get reelected, and then in 2028 he's not even going to be on the ballot. He's going to direct his new Vice President, Kerry Lake, to simply declare him President of the United States when he is not been on a ballot.
I don't know what the scheme would be. I think we can kind of laugh and say there's no scheme we could even concoct. But I think
that Macho, with the machine gun, he's going to walk in.
I think the issue though is that the idea of electing another president that has tried to circumvent the peaceful transfer of power using extra legal means, and then pretending we can't concoct a single scheme that he could try to circumvent other legal processes to have a third term or to have a longer term or to install who he wants as the next president. When a person has already shown you who they are, and when every single person around him agrees with that, when every single person that's worked with him, save for Sidney Powell, Eastman, and Giuliani, which I don't think anybody would throw their lot in with those 3. It just seems wild to me that we would say we're just going to go ahead and trust this guy with another term of president, but he can't run for a third term, so it's fine. When there's 50 million other things.
And I'll make you the case that if you want him not to make election trouble, you should elect him president in the next election cycle, and then he will be ineligible.
I find that to be a wholly unconvincing argument. Okay.
Well, recently in the news, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT failed to fully denounce calls for genocide, and that rose questions about the influence of DEI programs at universities. So maybe either looking at this or zooming out more broadly at identity politics at universities or identity politics, wokeism in our culture. How big of a threat is it to our culture, to Western civilization?
Obviously, I'm going to say it's a huge threat. The reason that I think this is a huge threat, I want to give a definition of wokeism because people are very often accused of not using wokeism properly or believing that it's sort of a catch-all phrase. I don't think it's a catch-all phrase. I think that wokeism has its roots in postmodernism, which essentially suggests that every principle is a reflection of underlying structures of power, and that therefore any inequality that emerges under such a system is a reflection, again, of that structure of power that used to be applied in sort of Marxist ways. The suggestion being that economic inequality was the result of misallocation of power in the structure preserved by an upper crust of people who wanted to cram down exploitation on people. That was sort of the Marxist version of postmodernism. And then it got transmuted into sort of a racial postmodernism.
Hacemos un chinga estas cosas.
And are perpetuated by a group of people who are, in fact, in favor of the preservation of white power and white supremacy. That is the generalized theory of critical race theory, as proposed by, for example, Gene Stefanchik and Richard Delgado in their book on critical race theory. That has taken a softer form
ahorita somos las del laboratorio.
DEI.
Si es que sigues ahí, claro.
Meaning equity. So equity is a term that does not mean equality. People mix it up. Equality is the idea that we all ought to have equal rights, that we all ought to be treated equally by the law. Equity is the idea that if there is an inequality that emerges from any system, it is therefore due to discrimination. And the best way to tell whether somebody has been victimized is by dint of their race. And we can tell whether you're a member of an oppressed group or oppressor group by the intersectional identity that you carry and by the nature of your group's success or failure predominantly along economic and power lines in American life. This means that if one group is predominantly successful economically, they must be a member of the victimizing class. And the only corrective for that would be, as Ibram X. Kendi likes to suggest, effectively anti-racist policies, racism in the service of destroying racism.
Vamos a clip
that you're going to have to discriminate on the basis of race.
110, güey.
Discrimination that's baked into the system. That's incredibly dangerous. It leads to a victim-victimizer narrative that is
verga,
unhealthy for
110
individuals and
millas
terrible
está
for
muy
societies.
cabrón.
It relieves people of individual responsibility, and it destroys the very notion of an objective metric by which we can decide meritocracy. And meritocracy is the only system human beings have ever devised that has positive externalities in literally any area of life. Every other distribution of wealth, power, done along other lines that is not having to do with merit has negative externalities. Every system having to do with merit has positive externalities because presumably the most effective and useful people are going to succeed under those systems. That's the very basis of
Ah, sí lo logré.
and the externalities of that mean that other people benefit from the meritorious and excellent performance of those people.
Maybe it'd be good to get your comments, your old stomping ground, Harvard. Do you think the president of Harvard should have been fired?
I mean, I think she should have been fired out of the plagiarism allegations. I think she should have been fired based on her performance just at that congressional hearing. If the word black had been substituted for Jew in that statement by Elise Stefanik that she was asking about, or trans, or literally any other minority in America, maybe with the exception of Asian, then the answer would have been very different coming from Cloudy and Gay. You know, with that said, I don't think the firing of Cloudy and Gay really accomplishes very much. Meaning, did she get what she deserved? Sure. Does that mean that the underlying DEI equity-based system has been in any way severely damaged? No, I think that this is a way for universities, as truthful as McGill Penn also, to basically throw somebody overboard as the sacrifice to maintain the underlying system that continues to predominate at American universities, where they spend literally billions of dollars every year on DEI initiatives and diversity hires and diversity administrators and all of this. And one of the costs of education escalating is in the massive administrative function that is now undertaken by universities, as opposed to teaching and classroom rooms and such.
You guys probably agree on a lot of this, right?
Kind of, maybe, yeah.
Carajo.
I don't know.
A ver, ahora sí
I
vamos a
don't know
acercar.
what makes things do this, but it feels like we can never have a good thing and then have it end as a good thing.
Vamos a estudiar a ver
Things
qué tal.
always get taken to their extreme, and then we have to fight on those extremes. Like, I would argue that back in my day, we called it SJW, Social Justice Warriors, before it became woke, almost like 2013 onwards, whatever. Like, there are aspects to wokeism that I think are good. Like, I like the additional
está
representation
disponible.
of media now. I like how, as much as people complain about the internet and how it's regulated, that there are way more groups that are represented on the internet, whether we're talking X, the platform formerly known as Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I think in some ways, or whether we're pushing, like women's
Madre,
issues
güey.
in school and in
Ese
the wider
primero no
workforce,
nos
I think
deja.
that these are all good things. The issue that you run into is people don't ever have a stopping point,
Vamos
and
a
I think
otra.
people kind
A
of
ver
get
si nos
lost
deja,
in
güey.
this woke for woke's sake thing, where we start to see these very weird warpings of these academic, arguments that are used for really horrible things.
Vamos.
So, for instance, I think that you can talk about in the United States things like white supremacy or things like oppression of certain demographics, especially with Jim Crow laws and pre-Jim Crow. You can even talk about effects from that. But then when you run into this weird world where we kind of warp these things so that not only is white supremacy still as present today as it ever has been, well, actually, black people and other minorities can't even be racist. They don't have the power to because we're going to use a different definition of racism.
Ok, tenemos que ocupar un auto. ¿Qué auto ocupamos? Vamos a ocupar el Elise GT1 del 97. Es un buen auto para este pedo. A ver qué sale. Ahora esperar a que esto entre. Creo que el Batuque no entró. Una nave de carreras. Buenos pines, bueno todo. ¡Buena nave! ¡Qué chulada!
We can only talk about punching up as opposed to punching down, and we're actually going to say
totally okay for these people to say or do whatever they want, and it's never bad. But like white people who have always been the oppressors, even if you're like a trailer park guy whose family's addicted to meth, you know, you have all this privilege, et cetera, et cetera. I think that you run into these issues where wokeism, it starts off as like a really good idea, and I would argue has achieved really good things, especially in regards to like women's education and everything. And then it just gets so academia-ized, there's a word there, academic, whatever, where you take something and you put it in school too much and then it comes out as some Frankenstein, you know, cancer like horrible things, such that today, when I'm reading stuff, I know that like if I hear somebody say the word, like anti-racism, I'm probably ignoring every other thing. If you utter the word like colonial anything, I'm probably going to say you probably don't have anything good to say. Yeah, a lot of it is just taken way too far. But you know what I will blame on some of this is I will blame conservatives for some of this. Because I think one issue that happens, and I think Ben might even agree with me here too, is I think there's two huge problems that have happened in the United States, I think broadly speaking. Is that one, we become more different than we ever have been, and two, we become more similar than we ever have been. And when I say this, what I mean is that like we're splitting off into these groups, and then these groups are enforcing this insane homogeneity between these two separate groups. And I think one of these schisms has been conservatives' reluctancy to participate in things related to higher education.
Batería está cargada, ok. Gracias. ¡Vamos! Autódromo B Cecilia. No sé qué es B. Sé quién es Cecilia. Una señora, yo supongo. Wow. Hija de perra. Hijo de perra. Dios mío. Estoy solo. Saco el batuque. No sacan el batuque, no es eso. ¿Qué te pasó, güey? No, este auto es foul para estas carreras. Buen circuito, güey. Esas carreras de laboratorio siempre están buenas. Meten ganas el diseño de los circuitos y en este caso no es la excepción. Son raras las veces en las que prefiero ponerme en modo de primera persona para ver el circuito antes que el auto, güey. En este caso vale la pena ver el circuito. Pero este Lotus es, como dije, un foul para conducir porque es perfecto, güey. Gira. Incluso en que la cagué, giró de puta madre. Mira qué dice. Esas curvas son muy buenas. Güey, qué bien se agarra acá. Nice. Primera vuelta, rápido y sencillo. Nice and easy. Mira nada más, qué belleza. Qué buena conducción. Qué buena. Circuitazo del que se perdió el Batuca. La neta. Qué triste Batuca. Nice. Tuve que frenar mucho, pero aún así se conduce muy bien. Muy buen circuito, me gusta. Este auto está genial para conducir, güey. No le cuesta en absoluto. Última vuelta. Eso, uff. Nah. Está perfectamente equilibrado este auto. Pues va, de puta madre. Uy, qué loco, esta nave está demasiado pro. Uy, la cayó horrible. Horrible, pero ve la ventaja que llevaba, güey. Espléndido. Espléndido este vehículo. Qué maravilla.
So for a long time, conservatives are saying, like, oh, you know, the educational institutions are against us. You know, Rush Limbaugh talks about how evil the colleges are and blah, blah, blah. And then what happens is conservatives are less and less willing to engage in them. So then you get this scenario or this environment where everybody that's engaged in academia on the administrative side are
Epitaph, red logo,
they're like even more so too, and I also want to draw a distinction between like the administrators and the faculty, because oftentimes when you're reading story after story after story of like all of these insane admins that are pushing further and further left, usually the faculty is fighting against it. A lot of the tenured professors, a lot of people in their departments are saying like, hold on, well we actually don't agree with this. But I feel like because conservatives for so long have demonized these institutions rather than like critically evaluated them and tried to like have like honest critique and engagement, that they've just like completely broken off. And when you only have a bunch of lefties or righties together, all those veer off like even more into their insane directions. I feel like that's a big problem that we run into in the country, to where conservatives have totally broken off some conversations, broken away from, where they won't participate in them anymore, and then the people that you have left just run as far to the left as possible.
Certainly when you look at certain institutions, I think that one of the things that people on both sides of the aisle are constantly looking at is, has the institution suffered such capture that there is just no capacity to fix it? And when you talk about the universities, I'm not going to blame conservatives for the failure of the universities, because they haven't been present in major positions at universities since effectively the late 1960s. You can go read Shelby Steele's work on this, where he talks about how, you know, he's now a conservative black person, a liberal black person at the time, and he was actually quite a radical black activist at the time, in the 60s, and he talks about walking into the office of liberal administrators who are largely on his side with regard to civil rights, and being a radical. Him claiming that the systems of the university were inherently broken, were inherently wrong, unfixable. And he talks about this, it's a very evocative episode, where he's talking about how he's smoking. And as he's smoking, the ash is growing more and more, and the ash falls down on this very expensive carpet. And the president of the university, who's listening to him rant and rave, he said, Shelby Steele says, I thought he was going to say something about this. I mean, I was wrecking like $1,000 carpet in his office being a jackass. And instead, I could see him wilt inside. I could see him collapse. He didn't have the institutional credibility or the intellect or sort of spiritual strength to just say, listen, I agree with you on some of these things, but you're acting. And what you see in the late 1960s and early 1970s is, in fact, the collapse of these institutions, to the point where, by the time I was going to college, there was this radical disproportion between conservatives and liberals. And the problem is that when it comes to a system like the universities, basically I separate the universities off into two separate categories. One,
me gusta,
STEM.
pero el grip.
The universities are still pretty damn good. American universities, when it comes to STEM, are still leading universities in the world.
Oof. JCO project. Veamos este. Una ciudad industrial, ok. Que se ve bien, A ver qué tal le van las curvas a esto. ¿Qué pedo contigo, pinche? ¿Cómo se llamaba el Chuck? El de Cars. Lo que sea. Me cuesta trabajo. El chepe. Lo saqué de la carrera. Vamos por ti, Poli. Vámonos. Gran chiste poner muscles clásicos en esta carrera, güey, grandes. Lleno de curvas, güey. No mames. Justo acabo de correr con un auto tan cabrón como el Lexus y justo... Digo, ¿cuál es el Lexus? Lotus. Es el Lotus y luego puedes conducir este Corvette, güey. Pero... Perdón, bro, pero... No hay punto de comparación aquí. ¡Vamos! Buen interior, para un Corvette de esta época. Me gusta el display. Está bueno. Original. Se ve bien, se ve bien. Este panda se quedó ahí, güey. Ah, es el Chepe, güey. Es el que yo saqué. Se deprimió, no quiso seguir jugando. El Drive Attack. Pasó, bro. ¿Cómo? Chinga el chip aquí otra vez. ¿Ah? Ahí vamos. Vamos por la última vuelta, mi hermano. La última vuelta. Ah, ¿qué pedo? What the hell? ¿Cómo crees? A ver cómo me rebasó. Ah, me ganó la curva. Es que desde esa cámara no tengo el retrovisor, no puedo ver eso. Ahí vamos. Dale, bro, que si eres bueno, en línea recta, dale. Y de nuevo tú. Cabrón, casi me gana el cobra, güey. Eso. Bien.
World. Harvard's main creations these days are coming from actual hard science. Then you have the liberal arts field, in which you basically have a self-perpetuating elite, because that's actually how dissertations work. If you have somebody who's very far to the left and you decide that you're going to write a dissertation on this, the chances that that is going to be approved by your dissertation advisor are much lower than if you happen to write something that tends to agree with the political positions of your dissertation advisor. Now, listen, I think there are open and tolerant professors, even in the liberal arts of these universities. I went to these universities, I went to UCLA, I went to Harvard Law School. When I was at Harvard Law School, one of my favorite professors was Lonnie Grenier. Lonnie Grenier was the incredible lawyer, released Secretary of Labor under Clinton, and she was too liberal, and she got rejected. So she's like a full-on communist. By the time I went there, she was great. We had debates every day. It was wonderful. She used to write me recommendations for my legal jobs after we left. Randall Kennedy, I don't agree with him very much. Randall Kennedy was a terrific professor. There are some professors who are like this. Unfortunately, there tends to be, in these echo chambers, more and more ideological conformity that is rigorously enforced, and it is by left on left. So, for example, when I was at Harvard Law School, the president of the university was another president who ended up being ousted, Larry Summers. Larry Summers had been the Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, and he made the critical error of suggesting that perhaps the dearth of women in hard sciences in prestigious positions was due to possibly two factors that people were refusing to talk about. One was the possibility that women actually didn't want to be in hard sciences at nearly the rate that men do, which happens to be true. And two was the distribution of STEM IQ, right, which is something that you certainly were not allowed to talk about. The idea that the men's bell curve when it comes to IQ in STEM subjects tends to be shallower than women's bell curve. So when you get to the very end of the bell curve, what you tend to see is a lot of really dumb guys and a lot of really smart guys. So when you're talking about the top universities, maybe that has something to do with the disproportion. He's trying to explain that to say that our systems are not discriminating. If we end up with more men than women, more men are qualified. That's what
Ojo, cabrón, ¿qué estás haciendo? Pasa.
Faculty at Harvard University. There's a lot to blame conservatives for surrendering. I totally agree that conservatives should not surrender the blame field. In some institutions, colleges were surrendered a lot earlier than 20 years ago. They were surrendered in the late 1960s or early 70s.
Yeah, so I think that a couple things. So one of the big issues that I have with kind of like this, I don't know if we call it era of Trumpism or populism, is this total disregard for institutions and this disconnect from participation in the system. So it's one of the big things that I fight with progressives about, who cares because they're all 20 years old, they don't vote anyway. But it's another thing that I notice with a lot of people that are Trump voters, Trump fans or whatever, is this idea where we say this institution is irrevocably destroyed. It's irredeemable, it can't be saved, nothing that we do can fix it. And I think that what they're doing is, one, they disconnect further, and then two, there's a general hopelessness when it comes to how society is like ran or structured, such that you fall into that populist brain rot of the only person that can save me is Donald Trump. I can't trust him anymore. And I think that when you start driving people into that direction, all it does is it further amplifies all the problems that
Dystopian ruins. Ruinas distópicas. Creo que dices.
I want there to be more conservatives that are trying to participate in academia, but I feel like the leading thought or the leading speaking out against it is basically saying it's a waste of time. It's completely
Vamos a ver la
I think
broqui.
the alternative to that is that you're seeing on the right
Llevamos la broqui, que es una bronco modificada para la roca, para la piedra. Viva la piedra, banda. Mira esa belleza. Eres esa máquina, esta perra, güey. Hinchalo, gay. Tienes que jugar FORZA, ¿ves? Ay, cabrón. Hey, a ver, este mapa se ve bueno. A ver, ruinas distópicas. Ay, cabrón, espérate. Tiene mucho. Hombre, esto es viejo. ¡Ah, otra vez! Uy. Son como unas ruinas distópicas. Cosas raras. ¡Ah! Cabrón, son un culero este sueño, güey. Mira. Güey, ¿qué pedo con esto, güey? Guerrero se come al Aldo. No pongas eso en el chat, Aldo. Deja de manifestar tus deseos homosexuales paternales conmigo. Yo no voy a hacer nada de eso, güey. Basta. Lo único que Me como aquí. No sé ese chiste. Ah, ya sé qué mapa es este. Son las ruinas del mapa. Pueden ser un chingo. Pero nada, güey. Pinches dos vueltas a este cabrón. Todo cubierto por agua, todo horrible. ¿Qué diseño este cabrón? Se ve bien, o sea, estéticamente está en chingón en estas ruinas, pero ha dado una recompensa sobre eso mismo. Bueno, es la recompensa de este canal. ¡Ay, cabrón! Güey. ¡Oh! Está cabrón, está la chingada. No tengo gris. No, nada. Y eso es una vuelta, mi hermano. También apenas voy a acabar la primera vuelta. Hijo de perra, este mapa, güey. No quiero gastar mis puntos, dice. ¡Gástalos, cabrón! No pasa nada. Tendrías más puntos si vieras más los streams, pero al parecer no lo haces. Pequeño desgraciado. Sube. No, haces no. Se atoró el bronqui. Ay, güey. Güey, esto es una vuelta, güey. Tengo que hacerlo otra vez todo esto. Ok. Vamos, empecemos con este mapa. Se supone que estas son unas ruinas distópicas. Todo está destruido, tal como en las ruinas. Justamente. Qué loco. Uy, el control está difícil, ¿eh? Porque no hay grip. Como está lloviendo, todo está lleno de tormenta, de tierra, destrucción. Esto pasa. Esto será un buen tiempo. Y este mapa yo lo reconozco. Es un mapa que obviamente no está así en ruinas. Está chido esto, que sacaron una versión en ruinas de un mapa que ya existe. Sería bueno que hicieran eso con varios mapas más. Hay algunos que sería genial, como el de Seúl, por ejemplo. Podría ser. Y el miau, dice el Aldo. No sé. ¿Qué piso? What the hell? ¿Cómo es que me giré, güey? Desconozco dónde esté el Mau, la verdad es que pues ni idea, mi hermano. Así es esto de la vida, ¿sabes? La gente viene, la gente va. ¿Qué podemos hacer? Como ya no jugamos GTA aquí, pues todo nos usó para el GTA. Para estar mame porque lo veamos, ¿no? Un mapa distópico más difícil de parece, porque hay demasiados obstáculos en la pista. Cosas con las que puedes chocar en cualquier momento y tirar. Por eso estoy en esta primera persona, porque en la cámara normal del auto, se te van muchos obstáculos, chocas con todo. Pero bueno, mi favorito de los 3 de esta semana. ¡Oh! Me caí. Está el mismo lugar de siempre en el GTA, el JA. Vamos a poner. Si estoy conectado, ¿te sale? Yo no. Bueno, lo tengo, yo lo borré de Xbox. Yo lo borré. Eso, salta, no. Lo hicimos. No mames, pinches ruinas no están fáciles. Puntos. Ay, super wheel de pin. Vamos a darle a un super wheel spin, güey. ¿Cuándo se actualiza el Overwatch? Ay, no sé, güey. ¿Cómo que cuándo se actualiza? Yo no trabajo en Blizzard, güey. O en Microsoft. O quien sea que sea dueño ahora de esos güeyes. Creo que ya es todo. A ver, déjame ver acá. Es todo, chavos. Es toda, como dice el martes. Fíjate, el fandom sí sabe, güey. Yo no sé. Pero mira, lo que sé es que voy a tirar un super wheel spin. A ver qué sale, a ver qué sale. Ok. No, pendejo, le di A. Era B para salir. Güey, no mames. 60. Último. Como cuáles dice, no tienes idea, güey. No, güey, 5 otra vez. Neta mierda. No, hombre, güey, qué mamada. Hyundai Kona. El otro era el hatchback. Ahí chécalo. El fandom, ahí chécalo. Era este, ¿no? El que tenía el pinche white body. ¡Hey, body! Ah, no, era Gia Body, güey. En el gimnasio en el que entrenaba había un güey que sí llegaba y empezaba a gritar ¡Yeah, body! ¡Yeah, body! Cada vez que iba a jalar, güey. Se veía bien cagado ese cabrón. Ayer fui a otro gym. Muchas baby girls. No, mentira, estaba regular. Nada fuera de lo común, la verdad es que. Yo ya soy un hombre Sigma y a mí me importan las mujeres, ya no sé de eso, güey. Tú me dices, mira esa morra está chida, y yo te digo, no vale. ¿Sabes qué está más chido? El cripto. No me importa. Yo le tengo miedo a las mujeres. Oh, mira, ese sí tiene un white body, a ver. Normal, white body. Normal, white body. ¿Cómo se ve mejor? ¿Con white body? No me encanta ese white body, la verdad no está tan bonito, pero... Una cosa, tiene... ¿Por qué perdió tracción trasera? Sí tiene algún retraído. ¿Pero es una membership o qué? ¿De qué? ¿Del gimnasio? ¿Para hacer smegma? ¿Por qué? De gym. Pues claro, güey. Obvio. No que fuera gratis, maestro. No, manches. Viste que fuiste a otro, güey. O sea, pagas una membership que cuesta como 500 y tantos al mes y puedes ir a entrenar a cualquiera de sus sucursales. ¿Sacas? ¿Topas? ¿Do you topas, bro? Puedes ir a varios. Por ejemplo, había por ahí por donde estaba Qualfon, hay un putazo de gimnasios. Todavía muchos. ¿Por dónde más? Casi toda la ciudad hay. ¿Cuál es? Es el amarillo. No voy a decir su nombre porque no me pagan. Es un amarillo. Ay, joder, pero voy a llorar. La gripe. Es uno amarillo. Muy inteligente. Mamada. Ese gimnasio inteligente. Ándale ese. Ese que acabas de poner. Ese. No me pagan, así que no diré su nombre. Es más, no es ese. No, sí es ese. Sí es ese. Vamos a meterle filtro de aire. Hágate patpetka. Un mejor Edlipon. Una caja de cambio patgrate. Esa madre tiene supercharger. Ay, joder, perra. Joder, su madre, güey. Si está chido, si vale la pena. Pues sí, es un buen gimnasio. Está bien. O sea, depende. Como son gimnasios, algunos llevan más tiempo que otros. Los que son más viejos a veces no están tan bien cuidados, pero no están mal. O sea, están mejor que un gym de bar. Tienes agua caliente, te puedes ir a bañar ahí pues, todos los días si quieres. Hay agua para beber. Pues está bien, tiene equipo. Digo, obviamente hay otros gimnasios que tal vez tienen más equipo. Pero para el entrenamiento general de todo el mundo está más que bien. Hay muchos güeyes que dicen, no, es que el Smart Fit es para nenitas. El gimnasio de barrio es el mejor. Cállate, cabrón. Yo no quiero salir del pinche gimnasio lleno de óxido, brother. Tranquilo. Pero son mamadas. O sea, es un gimnasio normal. Está bien. Aparte, si pagas la membresía Black, que es la que es un poco más cara, pero te da acceso a todos los gimnasios. Entonces, en cualquier momento puedes entrenar en cualquier gimnasio del país. Si un día estás en Brasil, también podrías entrar a uno en Brasil. No sé por qué chingados irías a Brasil, pero puedes entrar a un gimnasio en Brasil. Y dependiendo de la zona, si hay culos. Por donde tú vives, yo nunca he ido a uno, realmente. ¿Sabes qué podemos hacer? Ahí, como yo tengo la Black, puedo meter a alguien gratis. Un día, bueno, son 10 visitas o 5 visitas al mes, no me acuerdo, pero puedo meter a alguien que no tenga membresía. Podemos ver un día para que veas si te gustó, ¿no? Es un gimnasio, o sea, no tiene nada especial. Sí, está chido. Wild Body no me gusta, está un pinche feo. La verdad. Me acabo de meter un Wild Body a un pinche McLaren. O sea, no soy cualquier cosa, pero este particular no. Oh, mira, ya con el alerón se ve bien. Sí, con el alerón me gusta. Ahí sí ya. Creo que se ve más perro. Pero no es tan rápido, ¿eh? O sea, ahí va, pero no es tan rápido. Lo que sí es cuando se controla bien. O sea, voy sin frenar a 170. Ahí casi no frené y giré. Valencia. Ese auto. Está bueno, está bien. Pinche güey, esa madre es un alerón gigantesco, cabrón. Mira nada más qué belleza, güey. Oh yeah. Bueno, vamos a comprarlo. Tengo capital, mi hermano. No es un problema. 58,000, qué barato. Échalo. Me parece un buen precio. Asequible. Perro. Pero bueno. No me encanta cómo se hace pinche baile. Es bastante integrado en el auto, pero el alerón creo que compensa un poquito. No me encanta. No me encanta, pero mira. Ya quedó y ya me voy. Cuádrate, chavo. Tu caimán, pero ya viste mi Jaguar con white body. ¿Ya viste, güey? ¿Ya viste, güey? Hasta el Porsche se queda callado, ¿sabes? Porque sabe quién gana.
Welcome back, Alejandro.
Mira nada más. Mira nada más. Ve ese ancho, güey. Está casi tan ancho como el trasero del Phantom. Es bastante. Uy, eso no me gusta. Mira, aquí atrás, apenitas, güey. Queda un fitment bueno, güey, rico. 5 graditos de inclinación. Mira, atrás se ve, no mames, si se ve muy cabrón atrás, güey. Del frente, no me gusta cómo se ve. Voy a meter un ángulo de inclinación enfrente para que tenga un poquito de disminución en esa diferencia, mano. Está cabrón. Voy a poner 3 graditos, 0.3 grados de inclinación para ver cómo que queda. Algo. No me encanta cómo se ve, güey. La verdad. La verdad no me encanta cómo se ve. Tal vez el color ayude. No me gusta. Bueno, eso es muy viejo. Tú no es gay. Es más, tú eres gay. Ya díselo al mundo fandom. Diles. Acéptate como eres. Ya te dije que está solo en tu cabeza esa idea de que no te van a aceptar. Claro que te vamos a aceptar. Todos aceptaremos tu homosexualidad. Es normal, brother. No pasa nada. ¿Ok? Ya. Deja de ocultar tu evidente gaycismo. Mira, Jaguar, no mames. Jaguar F-Type, edición Master Edition. Master Chef. Master Chef. Master Chef. Edición Master Chef, güey. No mames, el Master Chef. Agarran sobre eso al Covenant. No, Master Chef va a ser un programa de cocina espacial donde los humanos van a luchar contra el Covenant para ver quién cocina más cabrón. El Master Chef. Hoy descubriremos cuál es el origen de el Master Chef. ¿Será humano? ¿Perteneciente al Covenant? ¿Cuál será el origen del Master Chef? Turututú, 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 turutú, turutú, turutú. No, esa no es la canción del Chief. Está bien, soy heterosexual y a veces me da pena que me vean con un homosexual como el Master. Oye, no. No digas pendejadas. Mira, ¿te gusta mi Jaguar F-Type edición Master Chief? ¿No te recuerda al Master Chief este auto? Ya existe un libro de cocina de Halo. No seas mamón, neta. Eso, güey. Está bien grosero este pinche white body. Este white body está muy, muy grosero. Beso, güey. Beso. Es como una vieja que se pone... Es una morra delgada que se pone pinches gigantes y... BBL así loco, güey. Es así de grosero este coche, güey. Está exagerado, cabrón. Se ve chido el carro. Sí. No sé. No me gusta mucho este white body, la verdad. Por ejemplo, para white bodies chidos está este. Este es un white body chido. Este es un white body chido. Chidote, güey. No, pendejo, no. Para que veas, digo, mis respetos al white body. Es un McLaren 650 Coupé. Mira ese white body. Ahí se ve atornilladote. Ensanchado como tu cola. Nice, mira. Uf. Dime que no soy cabrón, güey. No. Qué belleza, güey. La gente dice, güey, cuando vengan los robots sexuales ya, güey, va a valer madres. Los hombres van a perder el sentido de relacionarse con mujeres. Yo digo, no, güey. Ya existen los autos deportivos. Ya, ¿para qué quieres una mujer? No es cierto. Es un chiste. Ey, es un chiste, baby girl. No te preocupes. Un auto jamás te va a poder reemplazar. ¿Cuándo has visto que un auto barra y trapee? No, ese chiste no es bueno. No lo clipes, hijo de tu perra madre. No clipes esto, pinche fandom, güey. Un chiste. Es un chiste. No me controlar aquí. dice. Qué pendejada, Uy, sí jala, el pinche 650p. Ese alerón, míralo cómo va, cómo se mueve el aleroncillo. Muy tarde. Ay, te la verga. No, güey, no hagas eso. ¿Por qué haces eso, güey? ¿Por qué clipeas cosas que me pueden meter en problemas, cabrón? Ay, cabrón. Por favor, Falun, no la hagas. Quiero saltar ahí. Ese es un buen white body. White body. Intento un buen white body. Sí. Pero bueno. Ahora sí, me voy en mi Homer de Barbie. Así es, esa es la Homer que conduce Ken en la película de Barbie. En efecto, es este, aquí está. No hay otro que sea igualito a este. Este es el Homer de Barbie. O no de Barbie, el de Ken. ¿Por qué? Porque es Kenoff. Soy Kenoff. Así que nada, con esta belleza me despido. Tal vez regrese en un rato. Voy ahora mismo a ver qué puedo cenar antes de que sea muy tarde. Voy a compartir unas cosas, ver unas cosas. Y pues nada, con esta belleza del movimiento les agradezco por estar aquí el día de hoy. Gracias por ver este stream. Tanto aquí a la gente de Twitch como a la gente de YouTube que lo va a ver en un rato. Like, comenten, díganme qué les parecen estas naves. También en TikTok voy a subir clips. En YouTube también tendrán los shorts respectivos. Así que pues nada, me despido por ahora. Gracias por ver, like, comenta y se cuidan, chavales. Hasta la próxima. Bye. Te cagaste, ¿no es cierto? Ahora sí, adiós.